Hey guys, can you hear me? How's it going?
Great, isn't it?
You there?
Oh yeah, I'm here.
Yep. Okay, are we on? Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Hey, tomorrow,
Yeah.
you're gonna want Fauci first and then Pence, right?
No, Pence is going to be first. Fauci is not going to be until like the next headline section.
Pence on BLM first, then Pence.
Yeah, right.
Got it. Thanks. You were a little bit more quiet in the interview, the McAfee one? No. I'm just saying in general, if you maybe touch the game or anything right now. Okay. Is that better for you? Yeah, that sounds better. Okay, cool. It'll probably be like this. Yeah, double here. Sounds good.
telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from just outside the capital of the divided states of America. It's time now for the show that brings you real truth, even when it hurts. In the independent corner, I am investigative analyst and political theorist Shane Stranahan.
And in the unapologetically left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever vigilant, irascible political analyst, Jamal Thomas.
That's you all. That's you are, Jamal, and many more positive things, too. Get ready for the show that is the antidote to propaganda, as can be read in our memoranda. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, getting now into headlines here. I'm going to try this for the first time. We'll see how long this lasts. I'm going to adopt a British voice because that's more authoritative. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is testifying before the House Financial Services Committee today on the state of the American economy. On Monday, he said the path forward is extraordinarily uncertain. In recent months, the Fed has cut rates to near zero, bought trillions of dollars of bonds, and rolled out nearly a dozen credit backstopping programs to boost the economy and steady markets. The Fed has also pledged that it will use the, quote, full range of tools, end quote, to support the U.S. economy. Struck down a controversial Louisiana abortion law that critics said would have closed nearly every clinic in the state. Conservative Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the liberals in the Supreme Court in this case in a 5-4 vote. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany criticized the ruling as unfortunate. China has passed a national security law for Hong Kong, which critics say could effectively criminalize most dissent in the city. The news of the law's consideration was first reported by local Hong Kong media, and 2 hours later, the official Chinese news agency Xinhua reported the vote was unanimous in the Standing Committee of China's National People's Congress. The law is expected to take effect tomorrow. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam has defended the law, asserting earlier this month that it will, quote, only target an extremely small minority of illegal and criminal acts and activities, end quote, although she also said that Beijing had not allowed her to read the full text of the law. A radiation spike has been reported in Northern Europe, which the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment has said may be attributed to, quote, an anomaly in the fuel elements of a nuclear power plant, end quote. The levels of radiation detected in the region are low enough that they should not bear any harm to humans. The possible source stretches across much of Sweden, Finland, the Baltic states, and Western Russia. Russia's largest news agency, TASS, has reported that neither of the two countries' 2 power plants in the region had reported any failures. Puerto Rico's governor is declaring a state of emergency due to moderate and severe drought in some regions of the country. The government will begin rationing water, with some residents only having access to water every other day during the coronavirus pandemic. More than 26% of the island is experiencing a severe drought, and another 60% is under a moderate drought. The southern part of the island is where an earthquake hit over the beginning of this year. That part is suffering the worst effects of the drought. And our last headline here, King Philippe of Belgium has expressed his, quote, deepest regrets, end quote, to the Democratic Republic of the Congo about the Belgian colonization of the Congo. This is the first such expression by any Belgian monarch. Although Philippe did not name King Leopold II, he wrote that he would like to express his, quote, deepest regrets for these injuries of the past, the pain of which is now revived by the discrimination still present in our societies, end quote. Earlier this month, his younger brother, Prince Laurent, defended King Leopold II, whose absolute rule over the Congo left between 2 and 10 million Africans dead. You are all caught up. Those are our headlines, and that's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamal, what is your top priority for today?
So let's start here. With many people flinging their bodies into the streets protesting the murder of George Floyd, black, white, gay, straight, man, woman, kid, dog, everybody on the streets. What is the executive branch going to do? Well, certainly it has to respond. It has to do something, especially with the public firmly behind the reason for the protests and the reason that of the group itself, meaning Black Lives Matter. They, after all, get the most credit for being out there on the street, so they tend to get the credit from the press. Now, this momentum forced Trump to come out with an entirely performative, incomprehensibly meaningless executive order on police quote-unquote reform, which has such cutting-edge ideas, such as cops shouldn't be able to choke you to death unless their life is under threat. Now, I didn't think cops were supposed to kill you or kill anybody unless their life was under threat. That goes for shooting, beating, or choking to death. Those things were already against the law. While it was performative, I suppose there is some meaning behind Trump having to do that at all. Mike Pence's discomfort from this issue or issues arising from the protests is more interesting to me, though. Keep in mind, the public, all at once, is reconciling perspectives into new hegemonic norms around race relations. Part and parcel to that is what seems to be an awareness of the other side of history, or, for that matter, how current advantages or disadvantages are imparted to certain groups in the society. Now, this hasn't broadened into economic realities, and the disparity of outcomes of poverty exacerbates, or how poverty exacerbates those disparity of outcomes. But it is a social reckoning nonetheless. The only awkward and disapproving of the populace are the conservatives. Now, Mike Pence is on Face the Nation and is asked a very simple question. Can you say Black Lives Matter? Let's play the clip.
All my life, I've been inspired by the example of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When I was in Congress, I traveled to his home church in Montgomery. With Congressman John Lewis, I walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. I cherish the progress that we have made toward a more perfect union for African Americans throughout our history. And I've aspired throughout my career to be a part of that ongoing work. It's really a hard issue for me. And as a pro-life American, I also believe that all lives matters, born and unborn. But what I see in the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement is a political agenda of the radical left that would defund the police, that would
leave that out of it. Just
tear
the
down
phrase.
monuments, that would press a radical left agenda that and support calls for the kind of violence that has beset the very communities that they say that they're advocating for.
Now, I love this clip. Now, I love the discomfort in this clip. Notice how he first gives a positive statement about Martin Luther King. I don't know why. Well, I do know why, but he wants to get the positive first. And then he goes for the jugular. With protests across the nation being predominantly peaceful, he's castigating as violent riots and pulling down statues. Now, that's true. Statues are being pulled down, but statues are also being taken down. The monuments, and some of those are not being put up again because the society reconciles and says, you are right. The violence, however, is being dispensed by the cops. When newspapers around the country were looking at these, they would say the protesters were mostly peaceful. All protests are going to have some probability of people who are burning stuff down, whatever. But the overwhelming majority of the protests were peaceful all across the United States. What people saw was violence. Cops, savage, indiscriminate violence upon the American population. I want to make the point that the protests, however, go deeper than what Mike Pence is saying. And to make the case of all lives matter shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the term Black Lives Matter. It goes deeper than the basic economic issues. It even goes deeper than basically the defund the cops, this kind of provocative logo that these guys have accommodated. No, it goes into something that is indelible, that is somewhat tragic, and that on that level, the public gets. Like what you see as people protesting and everything else, and the term Black Lives Matter, holding signs as Black Lives Matter, it's not that much different than going back to the 60s and they will hold signs saying, I am a man. It is a position of impotence to some degree, and tragic and profound sadness. Sadness because whatever is taking place in your world, in your society, is forcing an insecurity in the individual So much so that that person has to project it outward in the terms of, I am a man, something that should be obvious and apparent. And in something that should be obvious and apparent, having to even say such a thing has a certain embarrassment to it. But that's coming from external, because the person shouldn't have to say such a thing. To put up a sign that says Black Lives Matter is getting across how profound and this deficiency in regards to the way your society views one versus the way it views another. That's not just how I perceive it. That is literally how it is. When you have a 3-to-1 disparity in the people who are dying, that is driven to some degree by economics. When you have a crime rate or people under this notion of violence, well, that again is driven by some degree by economics. When you see the wealth gap between whites and blacks, I mean, you can go from one stat after the next. And these stats hold disparate outcomes in regards to how one group versus another group. That's what matters. That's the getting to the nub of this notion of, yeah, I am a person and my life should be valued in the same way that your life is valued. That's the point. It's not this notion of black supremacy. It's somewhat the opposite. This notion that I, as a person, have to assert something that should be utterly and entirely obvious, that my life should matter. That's what that is. This is not a position of dominance of sorts. This is a position not necessarily of weakness, but definitely of this notion of torturous sadness that breeds a certain degree of belligerence and trying to push that notion along because it's a deficit of justice. Now, Pence is not looking at it in those terms. But the only way to understand it is to look at it through the lens of the situational awareness that's bringing it about. And that awareness is basically no one will go out and protest, holding signs, putting all the energy that is required to do such a thing, purely for performative reasons. They're doing it because it digs deep. Now the catch becomes, maybe not Mike Pence, but the other members of the society is picking up something because the other members of the society has had that subtle reckoning of sorts. The fact that we haven't got to this notion of economics and how the economic sphere directly impacts how your communities are going to have, or your outcomes in your society, your economic liberation of sorts. We haven't got to that, so society hasn't got to it. But at some point, it has to get there. I'm making the very basic point that these things are issues of poverty, and Mike Pence is fundamentally missing it. Shane, I love his discomfort in that clip. It trips me out to no end.
And it's justified. Yeah, he's in a weird way kind of in a tough spot like a lot of people are. I mean, one way to look at this, we've been talking about democrats and identity politics. Republicans and conservatives obviously and very, very evidently have a history of racism. And on either side, it's like I don't see the forward movement. I don't see the potential for forward movement in the parties. And so therefore anybody who's going to try to engage with the political system, which you have to make real change happen, they're stuck between Scylla on the one side and Charybdis on the other. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place in a weird way.
That's right.
And we can come back to that, maybe continue that conversation. Also talk about Fauci on the other side of this break. But we're going to go into a break right now. We'll be back in just a minute. Should be a fun conversation. Oh, and we're taking calls this next segment. 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society. Hannah Dickinson, professor and organizer with the Geneva Women's Assembly, joins the show this Tuesday and every Tuesday on Loud and Clear.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Shane Stranahan. I am joined by my great co-host, Jamarl Thomas. If you're in the Washington, D.C. area, you can listen to us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. You can also catch us on the radio in Kansas City, in the Kansas City area, at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM out there. If you want to listen to us online, we're all over the place. Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, YouTube, occasionally Periscope. We're figuring out our own Periscope channel after this long transition from one show to the other. Anyway, that's that stuff. Also, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. If you want to call in, we are here to take your calls. Although, I'll say this, we have this pre-recorded interview with John McAfee coming up next. That should be fun. That should be interesting. So anyway, I want to make sure we have enough time.
He was a very interesting guy.
Yeah, I know we had to cut a little bit off of the end of it, like the very tail end of the interview where we were getting deeper into the CIA and stuff. Just interesting stuff there. So I'm sad that we had to cut that just for time reasons. But regardless, it'll be interesting in any event. Yeah. So I mean, I want to come back for a second. We have Tarif on the line. I want to go to Tarif very soon, but we also kind of had an unfinished thing a little bit.
Yeah. Finish.
An extra thought I wanted to add on to this. Sometimes you can tell what's really important by looking at what nobody's saying, and in that sense, in the political divide, if you're gonna, what's the thing that bridges the gap between the left and the right? In a lot of ways, it's what they're each ignoring, what they're ignoring in common, and with the racial issue specifically, with like the history of slavery, attempts at reparations and the potential for real reparations, it would again probably take, at least in part, the form of an economic reparation. That whole conversation, wider conversations about stagnation, productivity stagnation, who that's affected in America, all that stuff. People aren't talking about that really. That's not what we're arguing or debating about. That's not the subjects that stones are being flung over. And I think that that itself is revealing.
Yeah, it is. I love the way you said that, by the way. It's the things that people don't say sometimes that are the most important, right? You get into this group thing. And I've made the point before, we don't have two parties in this country. We have one bird with two different wings on it. And because they're so close, but we don't necessarily know that from looking at outside politics, we think that these are massive chasms between these two parties. They're not. Militaristic and economic reasons, they are for the most part fundamentally the same. You said things that they don't say. And there's so many things that they don't say. Think back to before Sanders got into this race. Economics was off the table. That just wasn't something that they all that much engaged on, especially not in any kind of major way. And so I love that you said that. I mean, because I think you're right. By the way, what Democrats would do is give performative identity measures, not anything substantial. So Biden would choose a Kamala Harris because she's a black woman that can fit into that identity plug for him to say, hey, see, you won one. But did you win anything if there's no material difference in regards to what you get as an individual engaging your political space? No, I don't think there is. So, yeah, let's go to Tyrese. What's going on, man?
Good morning, gentlemen. I like the topics y'all bring up on the show, and I like how y'all use Socratic dialogue to get to the root of things. Y'all might not agree with everything, but at least y'all keep y'all panel open to different views.
Thank you, Tariq.
I saw an article. I saw an article dealing with the coronavirus that Spain went through its catalog dealing with wastewater, and back in March 12th, 2019, they saw coronavirus that was in their wastewater.
You're absolutely right about that. I just want to jump in real quick. I don't want to cut you off, and you can keep going, but I just want to sort of confirm for people who are listening on the radio. I also saw that, and it wasn't just some source. It was like the University of Barcelona that was saying it, like you're saying, that they found traces of coronavirus in the wastewater in March. I honestly wanted to report that, but a bunch of stuff came up over the weekend, and my fault, I forgot to bring it up yesterday. But you're right on there, Tarif. Go ahead.
Yes, they found it in the wastewater. So what that means is, Spain and Italy, that kind of takes off the pressure off of China, and it backs the U.S. with these neocons pushing Trump, with the neoliberals pushing Trump to a, confrontation with China. So in a way, it kind of takes pressure off of that, where Trump could maybe one day meet with China, with Xi, to work out a deal with the trade deal, So the second thing is this. I said in all the two articles, or like I'm not a climate alarmist. I'm a climate realist, right? So carbon dioxide is good for the planet. The more of it, the planet green. And I have scientists that debated a climate alarmist, and he showed out. Oh, he was putting out there, look, it's more than just CO2 that's causing the warmer planet. You have the sun, you have the rotation, you have different things of that nature, and we're still learning about it. And I put that link up with that debate to the tweet for today. And the next one is dealing with carbon dioxide again. What's his name? His name was Freeman Dyson Spears, man. After he retired from the university or college he was professoring at, he signed a letter saying that, you know, he's basically against a climate alarmist saying that CO2 is bad. He says, we're still learning about CO2. We're still learning about the climate change. And 22 minutes long or something, 23 minutes long, it's for people to go and watch those two arguments. And I think a debate should be held in a world where both sides can give the views of it, because it's very confusing to people thinking that carbon dioxide is causing the majority of the warming, but you got water droplets as well, and you got your underwater volcanoes that's going off, that's seeping to the top of the surface, then it's spilling carbon dioxide into the air. We got a whole bunch of variables that's creating it, you know. So that's all I want to say.
Thanks, man. We appreciate the call. I have to say, I am doubtful of this one, just from everything that I've read and just from the people that I've talked to and brought onto the show. But I watch them. I mean, I'm not against watching them. But Guy McPherson has been on the show many times. And like I said, he's the most terrifying man alive, because Guy McPherson will go into this kind of global dimming effect where you have, because you've put so much stuff into the atmosphere that it basically creates this kind of haze that blocks the sunlight to some degree, while simultaneously, because that stuff is in the atmosphere, causing a heating up effect with it. And there may be other variables around the planet, but that doesn't make it safer. That makes it that much worse. I mean, methane, for example. If you have a dimming in the reflection of Earth, meaning as the ice melts, you have ocean water that can absorb the heat from that, which allows for basically a heating up of faster element. You have things like methane that are things that create a super effect in regards to blocking and trapping in heat. I mean, I don't know. This is somewhat terrifying. Guy made the point that said, if you get rid of all of the carbon and everything else, if you turn to green energy tomorrow, that your planet will heat up radically because of the dimming effect being somewhat dissipated over the course of X number of years. Shane, I mean, is that terrifying?
Well, I've got a lot of stuff that I can say on that. Broadly, I want to get Guy McPherson. We haven't had him on this show. You had him on yours. I want to talk to him. I want to hear why he's so apocalyptic about this stuff. I am broadly, I believe that climate change exists. I believe that it's anthropogenic. There are probably other factors too. There's a lot of stuff going on here, and I kind of have my own take. I'm not a scientist, but my point is, though, we're in a take and call segment. We've got a few other callers to get to, and I do not want to blow on my underinformed opinions. I want to go to Tarek from Georgia. Tarek, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yes, I just wanted to try to put something out there. I think that when it comes to the whole, protesting and Black Lives Matter issue, I think that we should. I think the Black Lives Matter movement should be focused on basically a historical narrative. I think if Black people or we as Americans as a collective want real change and want the police brutality to stop and want real reparative justice, real reparations for people that have been, terrorized, we came really to America, I think we really need to do history lessons, and I think that's what Black Lives Matter should be focused on, history lessons about why there needs to be reparations, because if reparations is not even popular among, some Black people. It doesn't poll well. Right. And so I think history lessons needs to take place, and people need to be taught about Black Wall Street, because in school I didn't learn about Black Wall Street. So those who control the past, you do control your future. So people aren't aware of what happened in the past, and so I think Black Lives Matter needs to focus on and put a historical context to what they're fighting for, and mention these things like Black Lives Matter and Greenwood and stuff like that, and that just so people can have room to grow and understand. Oh, this is why reparations or repair may be needed, and just give historical.
Hey, Joe, I'm curious. Do you think that a space is open up now for that conversation? Because I agree with you. When Sanders was running, I was entirely against the argument, even though I agreed with the argument in principle. It's like, yeah, I agree with reparations. I think that makes all the sense in the world. But no, I don't think you should argue it, because you have a chance of getting Medicare for all, expansion, elimination of student debt, etc. Meaning Sanders and his policies would have dramatically helped the people at the bottom of the income scale. So between the two things, where one I know the public is dramatically against, and the other one I know is popular, you pick the thing that's popular that can ameliorate the concerns. Do you think, though, that a space right now, in the way that the public has been trying to reconcile itself with the statues, with the Mrs. Butterworth, or Aunt Jemima, saying, yeah, that's uncomfortable, let's not do that, or let's remove the Confederate statues, or let's remove the Confederate flags. Do you think the public at this moment would be more inclined to even have the conversation about reparations?
I think so. I think what's going on is there's mostly been a tearing down of the symbolism. So we're getting the public to at least symbolically be like, we're not going to be symbolizing these statues. But I think the reason I was mad at Bernie, because he could have used this moment. It was created for him. But the way you do it is, while you're tearing down the statues, bring up more history about why reparative justice is needed. So you bring up Black Wall Street, you bring up Greenwood, and you put Bernie Sanders was the perfect guy to do it. People listen to him. Bring these historical contexts out so people then can digest what real history is, and not maybe what they've been neglected of in school, but bring up real history. So then, like you said, the space can be created, and it is being created with the tearing down of the statues, but we need more history. That symbolic stuff is good, but Obama was symbolically the first Black president, but he did nothing for Black people. So we need more than symbolism. It needs to go into a narrative of storytelling and history for people to actually be able to move. Because symbolism, it's just symbolism.
Tarek, great,
thank you,
great
Joe.
call.
We
Thank you so much for the call. We're going to go now to, that was actually Tarek. We're going to go now to Joe from Virginia. Joe, are you on the line there?
Yeah, I am.
Hey, Joe, what's on your mind?
So I have just kind of an interesting observation on the hypocrisy of the public messaging right now from governors and mayors and things that
we have to be very quick. Please try to get your message across in about 20 seconds. We've got another caller here.
Okay, masks and social distancing are apparently important unless you're going to a protest. So they're lying one of two ways. Either
we get it. No, we get it. We've talked about that, and we might talk about that again soon. But we've got to go to Louise from Virginia. We're kind of cutting up against the end of this break. Louise, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yes. Good morning. There is something to be said for the Southern cause. To be fair, you should get someone on to defend it. And my big suggestion is, we need to hear a good reporter on the COVID in Spain and Italy, possibly being caused by the Chinese colonies there. That might be true, it might not, but I'd like to hear something about it. And also, what on earth is going on all the U.S. battleships and the U.S. troops, et cetera, et cetera? You don't hear anything more about the COVID spreading on them, and it must be spreading, but you don't hear anything. Thanks.
Thank you, Louise. Yeah, that last part honestly makes sense. We heard a lot about that originally. That was like a big news story, that there was the submarine, rampant infection spreading through it. From a military intelligence standpoint, it's not surprising to me that they're kind of trying to keep that under wraps. With the comments you made about China, the interesting thing to me about this stuff is how much earlier we found these samples than we'd originally thought COVID started. That was a malformed sentence, but we thought that COVID started in China in December. Then we saw, I believe it was in September in Milan and Turin in the wastewater samples. Now with Barcelona, it's much earlier. It's in March of 2019. So it's just a weird thing. Thank you for the call. We're going to go into a break right now. Back with an interview with John McAfee. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
And we are back again. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to get this intro out of the way real quick because we've got a couple of segments here, pre-records. We want to make sure we can get through all of them. We're going to be talking with John McAfee here, very interesting person, founder of the McAfee privacy software, although he distanced himself from it a little while back. He's also an international fugitive. We didn't talk about that. What we did talk about were cryptocurrencies, sort of libertarian economic policies and ideas, as well as the CIA and some interesting geopolitical stuff towards the end there. But without further ado, let's go to the interview.
Very happy to be joined now by John McAfee. Very interesting person, illustrious career. Wanted to go over some of the background of that, but also wanted to talk about current events, specifically cryptocurrency. How are you doing today, John?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be on the show. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So I'm joined, just so you know, by Jamal Thomas, my co-host who you see over there in the other room. And so where should we start? I'm thinking actually, let's just go right into cryptocurrencies. So I've heard that you've been investing personally, both financially and in a sort of wider philosophical sense, in the idea of cryptocurrencies and the blockchain as a sort of rejection, which a lot of people see it, of the status quo of the sort of pyramidical hierarchical system of governance internationally. I'm just curious, what did I get wrong there in that last sort of bit? What's your take on the value of the blockchain and cryptocurrencies?
Well, the only thing you got wrong about what you said is that I don't invest in cryptocurrencies. I don't invest in anything, never have. I'm an active developer and creator in the blockchain world. There's no question about that.
Interesting. And so what do you see? I mean, when I look at this stuff, I see a worldwide reserve currency system that props up a whole geopolitical apparatus that keeps a lot of people in a state of relatively low productivity and arguably in a sort of permanent state of psychological despair. There's a whole bunch there. Why do you think this stuff is important? What's your take on the value?
Well, it's important because, first of all, cryptocurrency is based on the blockchain, which is an immutable record, cannot be changed. First thing in human history that we can't go back and change it. We've been able to go back and change history, rewrite it. We can change a ledger. We can change a file on a computer system. We can't change the blockchain. It's not a possibility. So that allowed cryptocurrency to evolve. And cryptocurrency has two features which are unique. Number one, it's permissionless. You don't need anybody's permission to use it and transact business. If you're using the US dollar, you need everybody's permission. Your banks, the governments. If I want to send money to Iran and I'm in America, can't do that. Can't send money to North Korea. If I want to send money to Russia, it takes an act of God. So you need permission with fiat currencies. That fiat currencies owned, operated by governments or government agencies. So it's permissionless. And the second thing is it's trustless, meaning there is no intermediate party that you must trust, like a bank, like the Fed, like your government, like a trust fund, nothing, in order to trust the transaction. The mathematics of the process guarantees that what you send will be received. Fact of life cannot possibly go wrong unless you send something to the wrong address. Then that's your problem. You should be able to trust yourself. So it's trustless and it's permissionless. These two things make cryptocurrency unique. It means that you control your own finances for the first time in your life. You are not a slave to the fiat currency of your government. If you use the US dollar, I'm sure it's the same with the Russian ruble, the government can, out of thin air, create, like it just did in America, $2 trillion. It just pulled out of the air. That makes the money that you have worked so hard to earn far less valuable. It's a fact of life. It's a supply and demand issue like everything else. You increase the money supply, the value of the dollar goes down. So that cannot happen in cryptocurrencies. Well, if you choose an appropriate one, the numbers are fixed and the mathematics are known. And so you can trust that whatever value is there outside of the value in the market is going to remain there. But I don't invest in cryptocurrencies in order to make money or try not to lose money. But no, I build systems. And my latest is a ghost, which is called the Ghost ecosystem, composed of a privacy coin called Ghost, very similar to Monero, only it has the added functionality of being able to be exchanged on a distributed, decentralized exchange, which no other privacy coin can, because the other coins are old. Like Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the oldest, and it's just on its last legs. No one takes it anymore because there are more powerful coins. I mean, everybody trades it, and it's the most popular, but those are people who do not understand what it is they're buying and selling. Because really, if I send you a Bitcoin, you send me one or a fraction of one, forever after I can look in your wallet and see how much you have. What came in and from whom and where it goes to and how much and to whom. I mean, if you're okay with that, then fine. but if you're not, which most people are not, then you have to use privacy coins like Monero. That you cannot look into someone's wallet, and in fact, no one can monitor a transaction except for you and the agency or person that you were transacting business with. So privacy coins have value because they totally free you from everything. They can get you in trouble, like me, because I go out and promote them. I have not paid income taxes in 11 years. I make no secret of it. Every year I told the U.S. government I'm not paying taxes. It's unconstitutional, which it is in America. And prior to 1913, we did not have income taxes in a powerful country. And income taxes were instituted as an emergency measure to help us through World War I, but they were never repealed. So I just stopped paying them. I paid over $50 million in federal income taxes alone. And I promise you, I have not received $50 million in services. So I just stopped. And I told the government, I'm not paying, you know, where I live. Now, the IRS in America has the right to come and take your house, your car, whatever they want. They left me alone. When I started going on the international stage in London, Bucharest, Stockholm, Hong Kong, Beijing, saying, hey, if you don't want to pay taxes, the way to do it is to use privacy coins and distributed exchanges. You'll never have to pay another penny because no one, least of all the government, will have a clue what your income is. That's when the U.S. government, it did not like that. And after about a year of that, it filed tax fraud charges against me, even though it's known for 11 years I had not paid taxes.
So it was when you started advocating against income tax. That was actually when you got the pushback.
That's when I got the pushback. And then I should have expected that. And actually I did. But still, I owe it to the world to tell them what little I know about taxes and stuff. So in any case, and they charged my wife Janice as well. We left America, went to the Bahamas. The U.S. came after us in the Bahamas. We went to Cuba. We thought we'd be safe. We were in Cuba for 2 months, and the Cuban government came and collected Janice and I, took us to an army base. And the general came in and said, Mr. McAfee, I'm regret to say that America has demanded, unofficially, since there's no official channel between Cuba and America, that we return you to America. but we are disinclined to do so. However, you are now a very serious problem for us. We're giving you 72 hours to get out of Cuba and never come back.
Wow.
So we took our boat 4.5 days at sea to the Dominican Republic. We were arrested before we could even get off the boat by the internal security forces of the Dominican Republic. And they said, you have to go back to America. This is how far the long arm of America reaches, people. In any case, we got a couple of good lawyers, and we agreed to be deported to England instead. We've been underground ever since. That was, good God, almost a year ago now, 11 months ago. I don't know how I got off on that. You asked a question. Oh, yes. So this is the net result of supporting the concept of cryptocurrency as a means of freeing you people from an overburdened, corrupt government if you have one. May not have one. Maybe America's.
John,
maybe
I'm curious.
I'm sorry?
It's going to save us from an overbearing, corrupt government. I agree that the government is corrupt. But is the government really going to allow the domination over dollars and basically being the sole provider of those dollars to be usurped by one of these other upstart cryptocurrencies?
How do you stop it? This is the beauty of privacy coins and distributed exchanges. Keep in mind, with the privacy coins, they don't know who has it. They got no clue who or where. And with distributed exchanges, you can then exchange them and they can't stop the exchange. You understand? A distributed, decentralized exchange is run, operated, and owned by no one. I built one. By the way, I was talking about the Ghost ecosystem. First thing is the Ghost privacy coin. Second, the Ghost distributed exchange, which is live and up and running now. With those two features, it doesn't matter whether the government allows it or not. It cannot physically, possibly, within the laws of mathematics and physics as they now stand, not possible to shut it down. It's like, I don't know, trying to stick a spoon in a glass of water and rearrange the molecules. I mean, who cares? It's still there, right? You can stir it all you want. You're not going to change anything about the volume, weight, or other condition of the water.
Why do you think that situation is better? I mean, having people in a situation where nothing is accountable, meaning everything else is just singular, individualistic. How's that a beneficial system? I mean, even though the government is corrupt, the government still make laws, and those laws can interfere with whatever the cryptocurrency market is trying to accomplish.
I don't think so. Why should governments make any laws at all about your financial dealings with anyone? I mean, America was founded on the concept that the government could not do that. End of story. Your finances were yours and private. What difference does it make? The rest of the laws, yeah, you want to murder somebody, come and get you. But what you do with your finances, why should a government care?
But a government makes laws over taxes. I mean, the way people and businesses...
I'm paying taxes. I don't think we need taxes. Prior to 1913, America had no goddamn taxes. And we were a powerful nation. You don't need taxes. Do you realize that 67 countries in the world, some of them very powerful, have no fucking taxes? You don't need taxes to run a country. You don't need taxes to build roads, for fuck's sake. There are thousands of ways for governments to become their own independent corporation and make some money rather than stealing it from its people.
No, I agree with that. But I guess I'm saying, but the fact that the taxes exist gives concept that the government does have power in order to make laws around the way that businesses engage with one another, or for that matter, the way businesses engage with human beings.
Why should they? Let me ask you that. Why should they? Yes, if you want to make a law saying you can't sell a poisonous product, cool. That's got nothing to do with the finances. If you want to make a law saying that you must be truthful about the contents of your packaging, I have no problem with that. If you want to make a law saying, I want to know how much money you make, well, fuck you. None of your goddamn business.
Nope. And there we are. We're back on the air. We're going to go into a break now. That is John McAfee. A lot more controversial stuff to talk about there, but as you can hear, started to get heated. Regardless, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute to keep on with that interview.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Do you have access to a radio? Yeah, it's me, Max Kaiser. I'm here with Stacey Herbert. We have a new show on Sputnik called Double Down. It's business, finance, economics, ka-ching, fling, and everything in between. That's Double Down on Sputnik. Tune in.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. I think without further ado, we should just keep on playing this interview. I think we're limited on time, so let's go right back into this interview with John McAfee.
I know that you were, Mr. McAfee, I know that you were involved in the 2020 Libertarian candidacy. I know that you were briefly running for president as a Libertarian, or the Libertarian ticket, and now it seems like you moved over to being a VP for somebody else. That was the last I checked. I'm probably out of date on that. Could you please, that sort of dovetails naturally with what we were just talking about. What's the status of that stuff?
This is my second run for the presidency on the Libertarian banner. I came in third for nomination in 2016. I don't want the presidency. It was a joke. Not really a joke. It's an opportunity to shed light on the stupidity of the American political process and political system. It's just unreal. So this time I ran both as president and vice president. So I was running for president. Then said, no, I'm going to resign, and I want to be Vermin Supreme's vice president. Now, Vermin Supreme is a guy that constantly wears a boot on his head. Okay. Then I go, and I knew this in advance. Says, oh wait, I just discovered in the libertarian bylaws, there's nothing to prevent one person from running both for president and for vice president and winning both. There's nothing. Okay, they're going to change that. They can't change the bylaws in the middle of a campaign.
So you got the loophole. You got in there.
Because I found the loophole. So I played with it. I'm running for both. And they said, well, you got to be insane. I go, no, think about it. For example, if I win and I do something wrong as vice president, I can pardon myself. Or as president, if I get impeached, the vice president becomes president, and then he can pardon me. The other thing is, presidents in America are held to strict moral standards. If you get a job in the White House like Clinton did, well, the whole world comes apart. But what vice presidents, no one gives a shit what vice presidents do. So I figured, well, I could have much greater leeway. I could get a job in the vice president's office, and when they come to me, go, hey, the vice president did that, not me. You can't blame me. The vice president does, right? So, no, look at the advantages. So I played on this because I wanted to show just how stupid this entire process is.
I think it's exactly as much of a mockery of itself as you were making of it there. That was a little bit convoluted, but that's the thing.
I am serious. If you've watched American politics, I mean, there is nothing more absurd in this world. I mean, got one candidate here, Joe Biden, that honestly has to be reminded every morning what his name is and that he is, in fact, running for president, okay? And yet he is running for president, okay? And one of the two major political parties in America. And then the other guy, Orange Man, is God knows what to think of him. I mean, he's threatening to call the army out against the American people. If you don't behave, I'm calling the army. I'm going to stomp all of you. I mean, it's like, well, I don't know. Can it get any more bizarre than this? I don't think so.
This is the exact way I took it. I mean, he gets up there screeching bloody murder, but he's basically going to put the military on home soil. That's extraordinary.
Well, the Constitution forbids it. Here's the problem. See.
Well, one catch. Obama.
American soldiers have to swear an oath to uphold the Constitution and to obey the president, who is the de facto head of the military. So if the president says you're going to invade your own country, See, it's a strange thing, is it not? I'm sorry, I interrupted you, my friend. I did not mean to do
No,
so.
it's very strange. I agree with you. But if you remember Obama, with the last NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act that he pushed through a defense and a ministry of truth. Chris Hedges sued the Obama administration dealing with the issue of bringing military on home soil to put down a rebellion. But that was a provision that was basically allowed to go through. So technically, based on the provisions and the changes that these guys made to the rules and to the laws, they could technically bring the military here to put down uprising by the public.
But if that were to happen, you might as well just burn the American Constitution and the dictatorship, and let's not worry about it. Okay, let's accept facts. A dictator took over, and therefore we're powerless to do anything.
Yeah, it is obscene. I absolutely agree with you. So what happens from here on out? Basically, you've been watching the protests and everything else. I'm interested in your perspective on the events that have been taking place around the world, and especially in the United States.
Well, all right. It's a very deep question and needs.
Well, I think it's interesting to get it from you, because oftentimes we have lefties to give their perspective. And so you're not on the lefty track, you're on the libertarian track. And usually with libertarians, I agree with half of what they say. So I am curious about your perspective.
I don't agree with anything that I have to say, but I'm going to say it in any case. Here is the fundamental problem. At least in America, our Constitution was created so that we could create a government that served the people, right? To go build a road, go protect the border, what have you. At some point in our history, it changed from being a servant to being a master. We were supposed to tell the government what to do. What happens now? The government tells us what to do. Yeah. Go inside and lock your doors until we tell you to come out because of some horrible disease. Police have the power to say, you, step aside, go here, stand there. Fuck me. Do you think any American in 1776 would have tolerated that? They would have stoned that policeman to death. Literally. No, but here now, we step. Why? Because we have given idiots with a third-grade education, seemingly, although I think you have to have a high school education, a uniform, a badge, a gun, a stick, some mace, and says you may do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Now, yes, is there racism? Fuck yes. Fuck yes. But do you think white people also don't have to suffer under the authority that these motherfuckers have been given? Please, God. I have been arrested 21 times in 11 fucking countries. If anybody knows the fucking cops, I do. And I'm telling you, yes, they're racist. But fuck yes, they are just power goddamn hungry. Power over you. Because they got no power at home. The wives tell them what to do. Take out the trash. Mow the fucking yard. No, seriously. But they put on that uniform and they can tell anybody what the fuck to do. Stop your car. Give me your driver's license. You, get away. Everybody stand back. Put that phone down. No. Me, wouldn't you like that power just for a day? I mean, what would you do? I just go around doing that. Everybody, lay on the ground. I'm coming through. Lay the down and don't look at me. Do not look at me. Are we clear? No, seriously. That's the power that they have. I'm not being facetious, my friends. So the problem is racism? Yes, but it goes so much deeper than that. The problem is power, even to people that should not be wielding power. End of story. And that's just police, for sake. Their bosses, the mayor in many cases, our congressmen, presidents. Good God Almighty, we elect idiots in office, but we're idiots for doing it. I mean, think about it. We actually vote for someone who spent $100 million to get a job paying $300,000 a year. Now, what sense does that make? I'm asking you. Seriously, why the if you are in fact taking, it's supposed to be a job. We're voting, you get the job. Go do it. But I'm going to pay $100 million, even though you're going to pay me $300,000 a year. Does that compute? No. Even if you say, well, he didn't pay it, some other people paid it for him. Who gives a flying fuck? Somebody paid it. You understand that we need, instead of voting for people who pay hundreds of millions of dollars for the job, we need to vote for people that have to be drug kicking and screaming. You know, Dwight Eisenhower, there's our last real president. You know, he was the supreme Allied commander in World War II. Nobody had more power than him before or since. He did his fucking job, and he did it well. And he came back and said, I just want to retire and fish. I just want to fish. Is that okay? And he said, no, it ain't okay. I mean, look at this. The country's in turmoil here. We've got no food for, you know, we've got rations. You know, our industry is destroyed, and it's the end of the God. Do something. And so they shamed that poor that old man who should, he sure deserved to retire. And they drug him, kicking and screaming, into that office. And yet he served. And he, on leaving office, warned us. He warned us in his exit address, America, you are losing your freedom. The military-industrial complex and the CIA are going to take every freedom that you have left. And then he left office and went to fish for a few years until he passed away. No, Jesus God, that was the last president we've had. It really is. Ever since then, we've elected, really, seriously, I mean, he was a shoo-in, let's face it.
What's your take on what happened to Kennedy, John?
Oh, please God. All right, now, can we just be reasonable for just a few minutes? Okay, so John F. Kennedy came right after Eisenhower, for fuck's sake, okay, and he heard his words, and he was only in office for a while before he goes, God damn, he was right. Yeah. So he announces publicly, I'm going to dismantle the CIA, and I'm going to give, I'm not going to fire anybody, don't panic, people. I'm going to give these departments to the NSA, some to the Secret Service, some to military covert agencies like Navy intelligence, Army, Marine, Air Force, and on and on and on. Well, a month later to the day, he had an accident before he could implement that. Now, his brother, Bobby, who knew what the happened to him? 6 years later, goes, I'm running for president. And if I win, I am going to handle the CIA. 1 month later, he was shot before he even got to be president. Why? Because he would have won. Everybody knew this, right? John F. Kennedy's brother, charismatic, bright. No. The CIA whacked him like they whacked John F. Kennedy. They would have whacked Dwight D. Eisenhower, except nobody's whacking him. I mean, no, seriously, he'd been through the most horrific war. He surrounded himself not with his goddamn career Secret Service motherfuckers, no, with his ex-colonels, lieutenants, and others who loved that motherfucker. So no one's close to him.
Let's go.
Right, there we are. That was an interview with John McAfee. A lot more that we could have talked about, a lot more I wanted to talk about. We didn't get into Belize. We didn't get into the allegations of murder, accusations that he had murdered a neighbor of his while he was living in Belize. We did talk about the tax evasion stuff, though, but I just wanted to get that in there. Regardless, though, we'll probably have more to talk about that in the next hour. We're hitting up against the hour break here. We'll be back in just a minute. 2 more hours of Fault Lines with Nixon, or Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. We are the men on the wall, the muscular giants fearlessly springboarding into the blackness of political fractures. In the left corner, you have the blisteringly unapologetic, admittedly combative lefty, Jamal Thomas.
And in the independent corner, the smoking corner, some would say, I am investigative analyst and political theorist Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get to some of the top headlines that are in the news. So the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, is testifying before the House Financial Services Committee today on the state of the American economy. On Monday, he said that the path forward is extraordinarily uncertain. In recent months, the Fed has cut rates to near zero, bought trillions of dollars in bonds, and rolled out nearly a dozen credit backstopping programs to boost the economy and steady markets. The Fed has also pledged that it will use full range of tools, quote unquote, to support the U.S. economy. Congress has committed nearly $3 trillion in aid. The United States Supreme Court has struck down a controversial Louisiana abortion law that critics say would have closed nearly every clinic in the state. Conservative Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the liberals in the Supreme Court of the case for 5-4. White House Press Secretary Kaylin McAmony criticized the ruling as quote-unquote unfortunate. I love that. Unfortunate. China has passed the national security law for Hong Kong, which critics say could effectively criminalize most dissent in the city. The news of the law's consideration was first reported by a local Hong Kong media, and 2 hours later, the official Chinese news agency Xinhua maybe, I apologize for the pronunciation, reported the vote was unanimous in the Standing Committee of China's National People's Congress. The law is expected to take effect tomorrow. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam has defended the law, asserting earlier this month that it will, quote unquote, it will only target the extremely small minority of illegal and criminal acts and activities, although she did say that Beijing had not allowed her to read the full text of the law. Wow, that's disturbing. A radiation spike has been reported in Northern Europe, which a Dutch National Institute for Public Health and Environment has said may be attributed to an anomaly in the fuel elements of a nuclear power plant. The levels of radiation detected in the region are low enough that they should not bear any harm. The possible source stretches across much of Sweden, Finland, and the Baltic states, and Russia. Now, Russia's largest news agency, TASS, has reported that neither of the country's two power plants in the region are reporting any failures. Puerto Rico's governor is declaring a state of emergency due to a moderate and severe drought in some of the regions of the country. The government will begin rationing water, and some residents only have access to water every other day during the coronavirus pandemic. More than 26% of the island is experiencing a severe drought, and another 60% is under a moderate drought, with the southern part of the island, where an earthquake hit over the beginning of the year, suffering the worst of the drought. And last, King Philip of Belgium has expressed his deepest regrets to the Democratic Republic of Congo about the Belgian colonization of Congo. This is the first such expression by any Belgian monarch. Although Philip did not name King Leopold II, he wrote that he would like to express his deepest regrets to the injuries of the past, the pain of which is now revived by the discrimination still too present in our societies. Earlier this month, his younger brother, Prince Laurent, defended King Leopold II, whose absolute rule over the Congo left between 2 to 10 million Africans dead. I can't believe he defended that. You're all caught up. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Shane, so the King Leopold one bothers me, right? I when I was younger, I read King Leopold's Soliloquy by Mark Twain. And that book is disturbing because it's basically giving you an explanation that how leaders will say, like you were talking to George Bush, say 3 a.m. between George Bush and his God. And you say, did you know that there were no nuclear weapons in the country? And even if there were, was there a better way to do it? And he would give you all the excuses in the world on why he had to commit this atrocious act. I would imagine same thing with Truman and dropping the nuclear bomb. Well, King Leopold is basically giving an explanation of why he was doing what he was doing. The bodies that he was mangling, the arms, the legs that he was chopping off. And yeah, the murders, the rampant murders in regards to the rubber plants and whatnot. So it's intense for me that the guy is defending this, especially in this time around the world where there seems to be this kind of mass uprising on dealing with stuff like this.
Yeah. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, he was sort of defending him on the grounds that King Leopold II wasn't in the Congo, and so he shouldn't be held responsible for it or something. I don't want to misrepresent, but that's what he was saying. But I don't. Yeah. That doesn't fly. That doesn't exactly apply.
No, it doesn't.
I think tyrants sleep on a bed of lies or something like that. You know, they make a nest for themselves. You insulate yourself from the effects of your decisions, and then you kind of ignore the people who are trying to get you to be less powerful. And anyway, that's a wider problem, but it's really sad. We need to go. We were talking about this before the show. It'd be great to go into some of the history of colonization. There's a lot of stuff there. There's a big conversation to be had, and a lot of people take a sort of explicitly left angle or a leftist angle on this stuff. I kind of lean towards that too, but I'd also just like a history of this stuff, sort of sequence of events, who colonized where, that kind of thing, both, you know, the ethical side of things as well as the factual side of things. Because I don't know that much about this stuff. It seemed like it was sort of the Belgian colonization of the Congo was at the tail end of the second wave of colonization, where in the first wave you had like the colonization of the Americas, the second wave you had colonization of Africa. I'm leaving out the Pacific and Southeast Asia, all these areas, but I'd like to learn more about it.
No, it's fascinating, man. I mean, when you get into, so when we traveled to Kenya, everybody spoke English, right? And so if everybody's speaking English, that kind of gives a nod to, yeah, the Brits were here. I mean, at one point, Britain had access to like 51% of the world or something that, you know, after the Second World War. They were brittle, but, you know, they controlled it. After the First World War, I'm sorry. But the colonialization there, if you hear Britain talk about it, Britain will act like, oh, there were a few mistakes made. But, you know, we were able to help these darkies reach a certain degree of civilization. Then they would put a really nice shine on it. But when you go there and you see what the Brits were doing and the caste system that they were implementing, where even to the degree of like one can't drink coffee or tea or something to that effect, where they could be beaten for doing so. It's so wild. It's so out there. And there's such a disparity in the way they talk about it. So it would be really good to get somebody on the show to talk.
Yeah, like India is notorious sort of around the world for the caste system these days. Obviously, you have to know that.
It is.
I'm forgetting what the name is, but the lowest caste. Anyway, just it's been notorious. But I've also heard, and I want to get, you know, another area we should get more facts on. I've also heard that, like you're saying, that was exacerbated, intensified, possibly even just sort of set in stone by the British colonization. Although there was also like the whole Mughal Empire thing before that, or Mughal Empire. I don't know. I just want to get deeper into it. It's also interesting. Yeah. And part of why it's interesting in a weird way, I don't know, a bunch of different sides of this, but it's this interaction between modern civilization, what we call modern civilization at least, and like a wide variety of different institutional forms that took place before colonization. Something I've been thinking about, again, I still need to learn more about this stuff, but what I've heard is we get a lot of things wrong because we don't look at the history of interaction that preceded colonization. In other words, if you have, for instance, I'll take randomly, very, very randomly, Ethiopia, which is never colonized. Ethiopia, just geographically in terms of its position, had tons of contact, you know, with the Ottomans, with a variety of the powers that were in North Africa, etc. A lot of these countries in Africa that were colonized had centuries of contact. And so we have a lot of preconceptions about what they were like, but our preconceptions about what they're like are sort of formed as a result of these various regions having to defend themselves against like the encroachment, you know, the preceded colonization.
Yeah.
So it's this longer story. I really want to get into it. And part of it is it's so darn complicated. Like, you're not just dealing with one sort of hegemonic society, which we call the West. You're dealing with a wide variety of, too many kinds of society, too many types of institutions for us to easily understand, which is part of what makes it hard to get into, but also part of what makes it so interesting, I think.
It is. No, it really is. I mean, think about how a country, for example, when the United States was at war, at First World War, and Eugene Debs was speaking against the war. Well, the idea of the First Amendment didn't apply. It just didn't apply. It was fully understood that the government has a right to defend itself, and in doing so, pretty much any measure is to be used across the board, including criminalizing your ability to speak. We can nullify the Constitution in that regard. Governments take very aggressive action when it's to defend itself, and that would be no different for any government. So when the United States is putting pressure on a government and is like leaning on it, either with sanctions or something else, and then they would say, well, look at what that government is doing. Because your news in the United States doesn't necessarily factor in that the United States is doing something to make that country behave in that way. I mean, North Korea, for example, they would fire off missiles, and people are like, oh, that country is crazy. It's like, is it possible that maybe we're doing something, and maybe there's a history there, and the reason why they're behaving the way they're behaving? No, it's not. We're like, okay, fair enough. Like, it's pretty wild. I agree with you, man. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Let's see, we have time. Let's go to Fauci. I want to talk about this real quick. We have about 4 minutes to make this, for this debate, 1 minute, 30 seconds each. Let's play the clip. Fauci is going to have this conversation basically now about people being somewhat anti-science. And I want to have a conversation with about Fauci, basically, and the mask issue. Because I think we disagree on it, and I think it's an interesting conversation. So let's play the clip.
And that's one of the reasons why we have to make sure we engage the community as we're doing now, to get community people to help us, for people to understand that we are doing everything we can to show that it's safe and that it's effective, and it's for the good of them as individuals and in society to take the vaccine. So we have a lot of work to do because, as you well know, we've spoken about this intensively in the past, there is a general anti-science, anti-authority, anti-vaccine feeling among some people in this country.
I'm not anti-vaccine, but I won't be taking this one. I don't trust these things, and I trust them for some things, but this rushed to get this thing out there and then rush for people to make profit off of it and everything else, that's a horrible, horrible impetus to do something like this. But nevertheless, Fauci early on had made the argument, and let me just be I want to be very clear, I want to read it. He was on, what is this? This is on CBS News. So Fauci says there's no reason to be walking around with a mask when you're in the middle of an outbreak. Wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might make even a block of droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think it is. And often there are unintended consequences for people tidying with the mask and keep touching their face. Now, later on in this conversation, Fauci makes the point about money, or about the increases in the mask, meaning the cost of the mask goes up during inflation and so forth. And he also makes this point about how healthcare workers won't be able to get access to the things that they need, the mask or whatnot, if the public runs out and gets them. He says all of this in one conversation. Now, I said that means Fauci wasn't lying, because Fauci basically gave the information that was necessary. We're going to have to leave this. We're going to have this debate early.
Let's do it. Well, here, let's go into the break. We'll go to the break. We've got plenty of time on the other side. We're also taking calls, 202-521-1320. And then we're going to be joined by Joanna Fernandez talking about slavery and reparations. We'll be back in just a minute. It is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan that you're listening to.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States, with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. A quick update here. If you want to listen to us and you're in the DC area, you can do so on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. That's in DC. If you're in Kansas City and you want to catch us on the radio, you can listen to us 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM. Again, you can also listen to us online on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Spotify, sometimes Periscope. And yeah, that's where you can find us. Great places. And partly made greater because we're there, I think. Anyway, enough with the self-aggrandizing BS. Let's get into it. So we were just talking about masks and Fauci.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
so
I say he's not lying. And you said he is lying. Now,
yeah,
why do you think he's lying?
Because, well, so this matches with the CDC and the World Health Organization. From January through March, parts of April, but I think it really petered off towards the end of March. I remember I was reporting on this stuff. All these different organizations were recommending that people not wear masks. They were saying, some of the stuff that you were just talking about, that it's not as effective necessarily, that people might overestimate it. But what it turned out to be the case, because again, now everybody's recommending that everybody wear masks, as far as I can tell, at least in the establishment. What it turned out to be was just that, like you were saying, there are these shortages. Now, here's the thing. I don't like we'll go back to sort of the quote that you played, the clip that you played. He's talking about a public lack of trust in science, public distrust in science.
Right.
If the scientists are lying to you, then you shouldn't trust them. And I can't blame people for not trusting them. And I don't like that people don't trust scientists, because I like science. But a lot of scientists are not acting very scientific. They're not being honest with the audience. They're not being honest with the people. And in some sense, these people, while they may have been scientists, they're now like leaders of administrative bodies. They're now in governance.
Yeah.
They're kind of trying to bridge that gap. My take is our politicians shouldn't lie to us. We shouldn't be doing that stuff. And again, if he wants to identify where that distrust is coming from, he need only look in the mirror. That's my take.
Ouch. Wow. All right. Fair enough. I would say this, though. If you look at the document, he's telling you everything. Meaning, Fauci didn't make this argument as if this didn't exist and that this is the only reason he's telling you not to use masks. He's putting it all in the document at once. And yeah, he's saying they're not as effective as people think they are. Okay, how effective do people think they are? I agree with you. It's a political statement. Don't misunderstand me. But that doesn't mean he lied. I think there's a difference in those things.
Here's another quote.
One more point.
No, go
Wait,
go
one
for
more
it.
point. You also have to take in consideration the ethics and morality of what he's doing. He knows that the public, if he tells them the masks work perfectly fine. And by the way, they changed their ruling in April, and Fauci also changed in April. There were massive gaps in regards to the amount of stuff that people needed and the stuff that we had. Trump wasn't producing these masks. He didn't force the companies to do it. And so the only thing you had was basically what you had. And Fauci, if he told those people, yes, go out there and get a mask, those healthcare providers would not have had those masks, and the price of those masks would have skyrocketed. And it wouldn't have been hoarding. It would have just been people going out saying, I need to get this for myself, and thereby shrinking the supply that was already shrunk at that moment. I was doing the polling on this yesterday. It's like 70% of people didn't have the mask that they needed, meaning for hospital staff. So, but I look at that as an ethical question also. Do you tell people that, meaning being truthful, allowing the worst outcome to take place? Or do you create this kind of political tweak of a story, of a spin of a story, and allow the best outcome? What's more
Here's my take. I'm going to quote somebody else. I'm going to quote the U.S. Surgeon General. This is Jerome Adams. This is February 29th. He posted this on Twitter. I remember talking about this. I'm just going to quote it directly. Seriously, people, stop buying masks. They are not, that part's in all caps, they are not effective in preventing general public from catching #coronavirus. But if healthcare providers can't get them to care for sick patients, it puts them and our communities at risk! ! End quote. That is the substance of the tweet. Then he includes a link. Anyway, that's a lie. He's lying to you there.
That doesn't even make sense, though.
That's the thing. It doesn't make sense. And but here's my point. I want to get through this real quick. It does not make sense for anybody who's looking at it and reading the text and thinking about the one clause at the beginning of the sentence and the other clauses that follow that and how they don't fit together. It's obvious that it doesn't make any sense. Now, here's the thing. Again, where does the distrust come from? I'm going to point the finger there, not just there, but sure, there. Another way to look at this, it's a false dichotomy. It's not the case that, oh, if they recommend masks, everybody goes out and buys them. Or, oh, if they recommend that people not wear masks by telling this lie or however, white lie, if you want to think of it that way. Those aren't the only choices. I'll give you an alternative. They can be honest and they can ask the American public to take a sacrifice. If anybody has stockpiled on masks, please don't do that. I'm going to ask you, please send that back in. If that was the public discourse, that's a healthier level of public discourse that actually respects the people in America. And I think if we were on that level, then people would have a lot more faith in them and probably would have been more willing to take those actions. Again, there are probably plenty of people who are hoarding this stuff to resell it. And that's egregious. And there are good arguments to be made that we should have been prepared for that kind of thing, because that's exactly the kind of thing that you would foresee happening in one of these situations. And maybe you put regulations that prevent people from doing that, or maybe you just focus on increasing the size of your stockpile of PPE in advance. That second one's probably the better way to do it. Just would have taken a little bit more preparation. But this whole thing has been bungled from the beginning. Now, what do we do about that? Like if every medical authority that we're hearing about, and that we're hearing this stuff from in the United States is culpable of this kind of action, what do we do about that? Now, one thing would be reject them all, fire them all. I kind of like that. But then the question is, who do you replace them with? It seems like our institutions are just built on these lies. They're built to sustain these lies. And it's exactly that I think we're ultimately is so damn frustrating to so many people about this situation. You know what I mean?
It is frustrating. I do get it. It's like, don't misunderstand me. I do get it. But I also get it from the level that you're stuck with your decisions. And in a crisis like this, they are not going to take the chance. And you could say, whatever the reason is, but they're not going to take the chance of asking the public for something like that. They'll say that weird, ridiculous statement that, well, wait a minute. You're saying that the masks don't work, but the doctors and nurses need those masks that don't work? Like, the statement doesn't make sense. But Fauci, if you notice, he never went that far. Like Adams, Jerome went so far as to basically make the point of saying, don't give the mask. Well, that's a lie. That's a flat out lie. Yeah. The Surgeon General was not being honest. But I don't think you can say that Fauci went that far, which is kind of the point.
Yeah, but shouldn't Fauci push back? Shouldn't Fauci have pushed back? I mean, like, it's a set of lies. It's a set of interoperable and interlocked lies. Well, how can he take that's what we need. We need those leaders. Like, hundreds of thousands of people have died and are potentially going to die due to their negligence. Like, that's the level that we're at. You know what I mean? And I don't think that any public official should try to hold back if they're an ethical person when they can see the consequences of their decisions. It's egregious, man.
Well, if the consequences of their decisions is hundreds of thousands of people either dying or many healthcare professionals losing their life because they don't have the supplies they need. And I'm telling you, they did not have the supplies. When they came into March, Donald Trump is incompetent. They were at a loss. And these guys went out there and pitched that case. And I'm telling you, it is somewhat Pollyannish to say, okay, guys, don't run out and get masks because our healthcare professionals need them. But yes, the masks work. I'm telling you, nobody in power would do that. They wouldn't take that chance. Now,
and that's the problem.
I would say they don't take that chance. Well, yeah, but they don't take that chance because they don't believe society will act that way. That's the catch. I mean, they're not.
They're not making a society that's gonna, they're treating people with immaturity. It's like fighting with fire with fire. You should expect the leaders of our country to have higher epistemological standards than the public. That's the expectation. Why? At least. It's like, because if they're representative, then you'd think that the public has put into place, either directly through voting or indirectly through the people they voted into power, putting them into place. You'd think the public would put into place people who are like the supreme standard of honesty, of having a sense of justice, having a sense of bravery. All those are all sort of like brought up.
Do you honestly believe that those dinosaurs and Republicans that are in Congress right now exhibit a sense of trust and bravery?
No, that's the problem, man.
All right, then. So if you don't believe that, then why do you believe that the outcomes are going to be in some other particular way? Do you think people, as they go about their way, typically exhibit trust and bravery? I'm saying your system is ensconced with certain degrees of corruption that breeds certain outcomes, not to mention just the capitalistic impulse in and of itself. Those politicians get in office and they tend to serve themselves or the interests of their donors. So, I mean, so it's like, in this very specific case, they look out at the world and they say, we can't take the chance.
Well,
now,
we need people to take those chances. That's the thing.
But no, you cannot take those chances with people's lives like that. I just don't believe you can. Like, what do you? So you will take that chance. And what do you do when you get 10,000 people that died as a result of those nurses and doctors not having the supplies, which is very foreseeable and a possibility?
Well, that's happened anyway. Again, I'm not like everybody, as far as I can tell, who's involved at the highest levels is responsible. But what we need is people to speak out and break that gridlock. If you have everybody protecting everybody else, kind of keeping this tacit silence on issues of key importance, that's what keeps the system corrupt. So I understand what you're saying, that there's this disincentive for people to break out of that. But what I'm saying is that what we need is people who are willing to go against that incentive. Because that whole system of incentives, that system of pressures, conscious and unconscious, that's what keeps the government corrupt. What we need is people in the government to break out of that. And yes, they're going to get persecuted. But I believe that there are a lot more people willing to stand up for the people who are brave, who'd be willing to do this stuff. I think there are a lot more people than you'd expect. I think there'd be a lot more support than you'd expect.
They're going to get persecuted because 10,000 people are going to die as a result of their actions. I mean, this gets this whole thing of
no,
honesty.
you're making you're assuming that you're assuming that if they had done that, then 10,000 people would have died. I'm saying actually, I think quite the opposite.
I'm saying, I'm saying that's the likelihood. I mean, think of the incentives for people. Those people are going to go and get a mask. They have a mom, they have a kid, they have a sister, their brother. How can you trust that people wouldn't necessarily go do that? You can't. And because you can't, and because you look at their natural incentives saying they want to protect their lives, then you have to give some kind of deference to this notion of, okay, if people do that, how healthcare providers are not going to have what they need to take care of people. That's the thought. Now, that's the thing that you have to engage, because that probability of that happening is real. And you want to have this kind of Pollyannish attitude about it. I don't think you can. I think you have to look at it in realistic terms.
We got a caller, so I want to go to him real quick after this. And,
okay.
I don't want to cut you off.
I don't mean Pollyannish to be a negative, by the way. I just mean as a descriptive.
Here's the thing. I'm not saying that nothing bad's going to happen. I'm saying bad stuff's going to happen. I'm saying it's worth it. We need heroes. We need if we're going to have real leadership, the real leadership is going to come from people breaking out of that gridlock, taking the lead, making these risky decisions, doing it, ultimately because it's the right thing to do. Everything else be damned. Now, I'm saying there are going to be consequences for that, but we need people who are willing to face those consequences. That's what we're looking for. That's what I'm looking for. We also have Mark from DC. Mark from DC, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Okay, yeah, I just want to say, when I wear masks, I usually feel sick. Like going back 5 years, I always feel sick. I don't know about you guys. Then I want to say that Fauci I've never seen them really wear masks too much. I mean, even if I'm on a plane and the lady shows me how to wear a mask in case of an emergency, she has enough courtesy and respect to actually demonstrate what she's talking about. And because I only have 30 seconds, that's all I have. But where do you guys see this going if there's no vaccine until 2022? The airplanes are now, doing what they're doing with, no spacing, no social distancing. People aren't wearing masks. The riots. I mean, where is this possibly opening up? And that's I wanted to know what you guys think about that.
Real quick. My one quick take on the vaccine issue specifically. As far as I can tell, this holds true from research I did a little while back. There has never been a vaccine created in a time of less than 4 years, from the initiation of the trials to the actual release of the vaccine. That's complicated. There are things we could get into with administrations or regulations that slow those things down. And then there's this wider conversation about should you trust the vaccine in general. But I'm real pessimistic. I'm real pessimistic about the vaccine specifically. And the question, what's going to happen? I don't know. And what's frightening to me is that the leaders in our country don't seem to know either. They seem to have no clue. There's crisis after crisis after crisis. Like we were talking about earlier in the news, I'd kind of forgotten the Puerto Rican earthquake thing that dominated the news, that was like the inaugurating event of this year. That was New Year's. That was like from 28th of December through the beginning of this year. It felt like years ago to me. so much has happened. There's just been a constant sequence, a constant stream of these events. And in a lot of ways, they seem to be, synergizing negatively. They seem to be increasing the likelihood of seeing more of these crises. We haven't even really started to deal with the economic crisis yet. I don't mean to be too pessimistic, because there's also a lot of stuff to be excited about. Again, if you have a serious opportunity to criticize and reform our political system, and you do it well, that's an almost unprecedented win for the human race, because it's been holding people back. This whole corrupt international system that we've been presiding over has been holding a lot of countries and a lot of billions of human beings back from reaching their full potential. So that's exciting to me, but I'm also pessimistic about our ability to respond. That's my take.
I agree with you, Shane. But let's wrap. We're going to have to go to another break. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my disembodied co-host, Shane Stranahan. If you guys are in the Washington, D.C. area, you can listen to us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. You can also catch us in Kansas City at 102.9 and 104.7 FM and 1140 AM. Also, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like, share this video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, or call us at 202-521-1320. So you guys heard me talk a lot about the deleterious effects of poverty on a person and as a whole, by extension, the society as a whole. When you look at America, the appalling statistical difference in wealth between white and black leaps off the page. To discuss how slavery built wealth in the United States and the capitalistic engine of that time, we're joined by Joanna Fernandez, Associate Professor of 20th Century United States History and Social Movements in the Department of History at Baruch College. She's also author, editor, and film producer, whose latest book is entitled The Young Lords, A Radical History, a History of Puerto Rico, counterpart of the Black Panther Party. Johanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you so very much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So I'm curious, from your perch of the world, how have you been observing everything that has been taking place in the United States regarding the protests?
Wow. All right. Unprecedented in U.S. history, for certain. The racial diversity of the uprising, this early in the process of what could very well be a social movement, is rare. This level of solidarity was reached, for example, in the 1960s, during the second half of the decade after more than a decade of protest. So that is encouraging. It's encouraging that white Americans, Asians, and folks in the Latinx community are out in the streets. And in the beginning of the upheaval, those communities were fighting the police. And the fact that 54% of Americans in a poll said that they thought that the burning of the Minneapolis Police Department was legitimate is also very indicative of where consciousness is. But at the same time, We also see the invigoration of a far right-wing reaction to the protests. So right-wing people, far right-wing individuals are doing crazy things like shooting into demonstrations. One person was killed, I think, in Louisiana, somewhere in the South just yesterday or the day before yesterday. And numerous others were injured when he shot multiple times into a demonstration. And someone else drove into protesters, a member of the KKK. Yeah, so this is a moment of mixed developments, both on the side of those who want to build a different and new society and those who are interested in instigating a civil war and interested in a proto-fascist movement.
I'm curious, can you go back to the beginning for me? And after all, the name of, we're getting into this notion of slavery and how slavery basically built this particular society and was kind of the engine of capitalistic growth at the time. African Americans were a commodity in real terms. How does that influence and reflect upon our society currently today?
Okay, so slavery is a subject that Americans have failed to come to terms with, discuss, understand. So in many ways, I feel that this moment is calling for a Slavery 101 discussion, wherever you can have it. Where does one start? I think that first and foremost, we have to consider that slavery was an economic institution, and slavery in the Americas was different fundamentally than slavery as it existed in antiquity. So prior to the rise of the massive enslavement of Africans, beginning in the 1600s, although the massive enslavement of Africans didn't really peak until the 19th century here in North America. Before this period, known as chattel slavery, European societies, for example, and other societies were societies that had slaves, meaning that those societies had slaves, but the institution of slavery was not foundational to the economic production or the wealth produced in those societies. What we see emerging later in the run-up to the rise of capitalism is the emergence of slave societies in North America, in the Caribbean, and Latin America. That is, entire societies whose economies were organized out of an institution of slavery engaged in the mass production of cash crops, tobacco, sugar, cotton, indigo, coffee. In many ways, enslaved Africans were the first people to produce massively distributed commodities internationally. In the United States, and if you think about it, the United States is the seat of the possessions of the British Empire. So whatever is going to happen in these United States, formerly the 13 colonies, is going to have some kind of relationship to that foremost imperial power. Well, in the South, what we had was a population of 4 million slaves working in large plantations, mostly, who produced the second wealthiest society humanity had seen, second only to the British Empire. And of course, Southern society and the slave masters of the South before the Civil War were producing the goods that the British Empire was capable, because of its international networks, to distribute around the world. So in many ways, the British Empire and the American South were intimately connected. But that's not all. Money was made from the sale of slaves in the United States, from the crops produced by slaves, but also from manufactured goods sold to slave societies by New England, for example, and New York. So New England sold fish, grain, livestock, lumber to the South, but also to the West Indies. And half the ships entering or leaving New York Harbor during this period were engaged with the slave economies of the Caribbean. So part of what we see is that we have what is known as primitive accumulation of wealth. The primitive accumulation of wealth as a result of slavery across the country helps finance the early industrial revolution and the origins of capitalism. So this society that we take for granted today, capitalism, regardless of what you think about it, could not have flourished or even been launched without the institution of slavery, specifically in the United States. So the wealth of this country was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. And because in the United States, there was so much exploitation of that enslaved community, the justification for that enslavement was going to be significantly virulent. And what is the justification for slavery? White supremacy and racism. Why? And I'm going to wrap this up in a minute because I'm sure you have other questions. Why? Why was racism and white supremacy so virulent in the United States? Because the United States was the first of these countries to declare that all men are created equal. If you don't declare that all men are created equal, you don't have to really say much about the enslavement of folks. But when you do, you have to justify the persistence of slavery in that society. And that's where racism comes in as an ideology. And tag on to that 4 million American slaves produced the wealthiest society humanity had seen, second only to the British Empire. You have to have racism on fleek.
Joanna, that's very interesting. This is Shane here. Actually, we're going to go into a break in a minute here so we can have more time on the other side to keep on this topic as well as moving into the issue of reparations. I just wanted to comment. It's interesting that you brought that up. I've been saying something similar in the past couple of weeks about the unique American perspective. Again, America, like you're saying, a country economically dependent in arguably its first half, something like that, first half of its existence on slavery, and yet at the same time, during the sort of inaugural political events, of the revolution, with the Constitution, like you're saying, this doctrine of equality, legal equality and moral equality gets embedded. And so in a weird way, there's actually, I think, a potential for a right-wing perspective on slavery and reparations. Now, that's a little bit complicated, probably controversial, but I think the right, very clearly devoted to American values, honestly has a lot to fess up to and a lot to face when it comes to this history. But at the same time, I think there's an opportunity. Again, that's controversial. We can come back with your opinion on that. But I think that there's an opportunity for the right to sort of face its mistakes and, in a weird way, come back with a new American perspective that doesn't just try to make America great again, but tries to make, in some key areas, America great for the first time. I think both of those, there are elements of both of those. Anyway, enough of my opinion. We're joined now by Joanna Fernandez. Great interview so far. She is at Columbia University, an associate professor of 20th century U.S. history at Baruch College, City University of New York, pardon me. We'll be back with Joanna in just a minute. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined now by Joanna Fernandez. She is an associate professor of 20th century U.S. history and social movements in the Department of History at Baruch College, the City University of New York. Joanna, before we left, I accidentally got your university wrong. I'd seen that you were educated. You got your PhD in history at Columbia. Didn't mean to misattribute your current career there, though. Anyway, that's
okay.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. As we were closing out, I was talking about this weird sort of right-wing perspective. Don't need to get too deep into that. But I think there is this broader take that you raised towards the end of the last segment, where we need to sort of reconcile ourselves with the contradictions in our values, in the application of our values historically. And there's, a large part of that. There's a conversation about Native Americans, there's a conversation about our imperialism in the last century or so, starting with the Philippines, arguably a bit earlier than that even though. But there's this also, again, like we're talking about right now, this issue with slavery, reparations, the Black community in America. And I wanted to get back into that. Can you please, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Can you please sort of continue with this? You'd also, one take that might be interesting, you brought up this idea of trade. Now, I'm familiar with the triangular trade system. Something we were talking about earlier in the show is misunderstandings that a lot of people might have about colonization, and specifically about our interactions with these various regions, various states, where specifically, for instance, with the triangular trade, you had this system where slaves were being taken from West Africa to America. They were used to produce goods that were then sold to Europe. And then Europe would export those goods back to Africa, back to West Africa. Now, what I've heard is that there was this sort of degradation of the political process in these various West African states that sort of led to the decline in the region. Again, like Benin, the capital of Benin City, famous if you go back and look for it, a fairly well civilized place, like contradicting a lot of American expectations of what Africa would have looked like. But what I've heard is that there is this history of the degradation of those regions, of those states. Do you know anything about that? Would you be willing to get into that with us, if so?
Well, there's a book by Walter Rodney called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which takes on some of these arguments, but there was slave trading, or there was slavery of antiquity was common throughout the world. It was like petty, in many ways, a petty institution that was fueled by wars. So you acquire slaves as booty during war, and you integrate those slaves into your society, and they do work for you usually in the household. And there's this intimate relationship, regardless of where the slave comes from or what the slave looks like. An intimate relationship between the slave owner and the slave. So during the triangular the transatlantic slave trade, the ruling class in Africa expected that, didn't understand that what they were engaging in when they traded slaves for other things was, and usually they were trading slaves of other regions of the continent. that they had acquired from conflict. They had no idea that they were selling off people to be disfigured as human beings, but also used in these massive plantations. I mean, it's a long story. I think what your listening audience should take away is that the global economic infrastructure upon which slavery rests, which is capitalism, is a global system that disfigured economies and made economies dependent, not just in Africa, but in Asia and around the world. I think what is important is to bring it back to the United States because that's something that Americans don't often want to talk about. And I'm going to give you some statistics, and we don't have that much time. And then I want to talk about the counter-revolution that was launched by the old planter class after the Civil War. So the raw cotton produced by U.S. slaves in the 19th century represented over 50% of the nation's exports, over 50%. So the entire American economy in the 19th century was organized around cotton. And this economy is going to have a ripple effect on the overall economy. So in 1860, at the start of the Civil War, 4 million slaves were valued at $3 billion. By contrast, the combined value of railroads, banks, and factories at that time was $2.5 billion, less. So 4 million slaves were valued at a higher price than all of the capital in the United States combined. And New York City was centrally involved in this slave economy. The New York merchants controlled the shipping of cotton to Europe. And the Boston merchants were also hooked in through the Caribbean economies. Also very important, Connecticut insurance companies insured slaves and the cotton cargo. So we know that Connecticut, and I know this because I taught there at Trinity College, is kind of like the capital of the insurance industry. Well, that industry in Connecticut was built on the insurance of slaves, which were very valuable. Very quickly, policing, because ultimately that is the issue that we're discussing today. The first police entities in departments in the United States were organized to patrol slaves. That they were actually called slave patrols. Why? Because that system of exploitation was going to produce slave rebellions. And so the slave patrols were assigned to keep slaves in their place, but also to return escaped slaves back to the plantation. And the law in North Carolina and other states said that a slave patrol, upon capturing a Negro or an escaped slave, could beat the slave 15 times. And if the slave rebelled, you could beat the slave 30 times. Now, what's happening here is that you are deploying violence, white violence against black bodies. And that can very easily go haywire and get out of control. But you don't want to kill the slave because the slave is very valuable. You want to return the slave back to the plantation. And so even the language we use today, police patrols, but also the beat. The beat refers to the law that says that you can beat the slave 15 times upon capture and 30 if he resists or she resists. And that's why we have the language of the police beat, the fact that the police do rounds in mostly urban communities of color. So part of what we see is that white supremacy and anti-black violence is part of the DNA of policing in the United States. And on this basis, we can say today we need to abolish the police because as an institution, it emerges as part of this institution of slavery that most people, even right-wingers today, would say is should never have existed or was unethical for America to engage in this kind of exploitation of enslaved bodies.
Joanna, we have about 3 minutes left. What happened immediately after slavery ended, and you had this notion of, I guess, Reconstruction? Why did that fail? I mean, it seemed like Reconstruction was some kind of a valid attempt at trying to reconcile with the issues of race back during the time that the thing happened, meaning it wasn't like South Africa where you had this kind of reconciliation of sorts. It was an attempt and then like a backlash. So can you explain how the economics of that propagated and ricocheted through history, well, to where we are now?
Okay. So the Civil War is known as the Second American Revolution. Let's think about the First American Revolution. When we fought militarily the British, did we invite the British to return and help us reconstruct society? Absolutely not. All revolutions, whether in the United States, Russia, France, Nicaragua, all revolutions create counter-revolutions, which are bloody and deploy terror. Counter-revolutions deploy terror because the losing side is going to try, by hook or crook, to regain its power and reconstitute itself in society. In the United States, the losing side, the old planter class during the Civil War, was invited to remake society after the Civil War. And what we see emerging in the South, therefore, in this moment known as Reconstruction, about the rebuilding of that society and on what basis, what we see is the rise of the KKK, a terrorist organization that represented the terrorist wing of the Democratic Party. So that's where lynchings come from. Slaves weren't lynched prior to the Civil War because they were worth a lot of money. In fact, if you killed a slave, you yourself could be lynched, not because the slave was valuable because of the slave's personhood, but because of its economic value. In the aftermath of the Civil War, what you have is an unrelenting campaign of terror on the part of the old planter class to regain power. And that campaign of terror is not significantly unseated up until the 1960s, the civil rights and black power movements. But that class continues to be active today, and in many ways we could argue that the legacy and power of that class was consolidated with the election of Donald Trump. A proto-fascist situation in the United States, and the monuments that are being pulled down today, huge monuments, enormous, that are only built in authoritarian societies, by the way, are the symbol of the power of that class in Southern society, and its attempt to bring the freedmen, that's what the former slaves were called in that period, to heel. So the pulling down of these monuments is an attempt, belatedly, to come to terms with that neo-fascist culture and deployment of power in the South, of which lynchings are an integral part. And lynchings, as we see, are happening all over the country these days. But there's denial about it in the mainstream media.
Joanna Fernandez, I want to thank you for coming on to the show. This is Associate Professor of 20th Century U.S. History and Social Movements in the Department of History at Baruch College. Also, author, editor, film producer, whose latest book is entitled The Young Lords, A Radical History, a History of the Puerto Rican, the history of the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther. Thank you for the show. Thank you for coming on to the show, Joanna. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we are back live from just outside the capital of the divided states of America in the independent corner. You're listening now to the voice of investigative analyst and political theorist Shane Stranahan.
In the lefty corner, I am your indefatigable, ever vigilant, irascible political analyst, Jamal Thomas.
You're too hard on yourself, man. You sound terrible there. Get ready now for the show that is the antidote to propaganda, as can be read in our memoranda. It is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back into the headlines, and I have one kind of new one to add, just actually based on messages from a listener during the course of this show, so I'll get into that in just a second here. First up, though, in the news, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is testifying before the House Financial Services Committee today on the state of the American economy. On Monday, he said the path forward is, quote, extraordinarily uncertain, end quote. In recent months, the Fed has cut rates to near zero, bought trillions of dollars of bonds, and rolled out nearly a dozen credit backstopping programs to boost the economy and steady markets. The Fed has also pledged that it will use the, quote, full range of tools, end quote, to support the U.S. economy. Congress has committed nearly $3 trillion in aid. In our second story, the United States Supreme Court has struck down a controversial Louisiana abortion law that critics said would have closed nearly every clinic in the state. Conservative Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the liberals in the Supreme Court on this case. It was a 5-4 vote. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany criticized the ruling as, quote, unfortunate, end quote. China has passed a national security law for Hong Kong, which critics say could effectively criminalize most forms of dissent in the city. The news of the law's consideration was first reported by local Hong Kong media, and 2 hours later, the official Chinese news agency Xinhua reported the vote was unanimous in the Standing Committee of China's National People's Congress. The law is expected to take effect tomorrow. Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, has defended the law, asserting earlier this month that it will, quote, only target an extremely small minority of illegal and criminal acts and activities, end quote, although she also said that Beijing had not allowed her to read the full text of the law. A radiation spike has been reported in Northern Europe, which the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment has said may be attributed to, quote, an anomaly in the fuel elements of a nuclear power plant, end quote. The possible source stretches across much of Sweden, Finland, the Baltic states, and Russia. Russia's largest news agency, TASS, has reported that neither of the country's two power plants in the region had reported any failures. Our fifth story today, Puerto Rico's governor is declaring a state of emergency due to moderate and severe drought in some regions of the country. The government will begin rationing water, with some residents only having access to water every other day during the coronavirus pandemic. More than 26% of the island is experiencing a severe drought, and another 60% is under a moderate drought, with the southern part of the island where an earthquake hit. Belgium has expressed his, quote, deepest regrets, end quote, to the Democratic Republic of the Congo about the Belgian colonization of the Congo. This is the first such expression by any Belgian monarch. Although Philippe did not name King Leopold II, he wrote that he would like to express his, quote, deepest regrets for these injuries of the past, the pain of which is now revived by the discrimination still too present in our societies, end quote. Earlier this month, his younger brother, Prince Laurent, defended King Leopold II, whose absolute rule over the Congo left between 2 and 10 million Africans dead. And in my last story here, I don't have a write-up for this one, so I'm just going to sort of say it as it comes. I'm getting reports that at least one person, this is an interesting sort of small story, at least one person had a call scheduled with Trump and Birx. It was going to be taking place at 5:40 p.m. today. It was going to be on ivermectin, this drug, and at 2:33 p.m., that call was canceled by the chief of staff to VP Pence. And then there's this story, and this is the real news. This is actually something I missed back in the day. It's pretty darn shocking, in my opinion. Apparently, Pence's chief of staff, the guy who shut down this meeting, he owns between $500,000 and $1.64 million worth of individual stocks in companies doing work related to the Trump administration's pandemic response. The question I'm asking is, does he own stock in any of the medications that would be competing with this one that this guy was trying to submit? In other words, is there a conflict of interest sort of at this almost highest level, penultimate level? Is there a conflict of interest keeping our politicians from finding real solutions and from sharing those with people who can make effective decisions based on those solutions. Anyway, that's a sort of quasi-story. I'm just getting that. I want to say that's relatively unconfirmed. What is confirmed, however, is back in May, NPR did this report on this guy, the chief of staff, saying that, yeah, he did have ownership. He did have some investments in companies doing pandemic work. Again, I don't know exactly the details of that. We can get into that later, but it does beg this question. What are the shenanigans? What exactly is the nature of the various types of shenanigans going on in the White House that's keeping us from having an effective policy response to this pandemic? That is my last story there. And with that, I'll wrap up the headlines, probably talk about them on the other side of this, but regardless, that's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, now we're getting into it. Yeah, that last story there, again, kind of unconfirmed. I had just gotten that. I just wanted to throw that in. A longtime listener of the show sent that in while the show was ongoing. We need to look into that a little bit more later. But it does, again, we were talking about Fauci earlier. We're talking about incompetence, ineptitude, a bunch of worse words we could probably use for it. The absolute failure in the U.S. government to effectively respond to this, both in advance and while it's been happening for months now.
That's right. I mean, it's so true. You asked, what prevents the government from taking rational action? Well, rational action, rational action is dependent upon what you're trying to accomplish, right? I mean, there's no absolutes in this. People, like God has not instantiated any particular point of view in your reality, meaning you have to choose on some level, or your society implicitly or explicitly chooses. Well, we have a society of sheep. And I don't mean that necessarily in a horrible way. I just mean people function on the things that they deal with on a daily basis. They have to work. They have to be able to pay for their kids. They have to pay for the house. And those are the things that function, and they don't entirely pay attention to the larger world of politics, nor are they even schooled in those things when they're in school. So it's like they get out and they have all of this other stuff to do and they leave the political system alone, or they just believe that politics is just going to vote for 4 years. So you have a lot of people who, for the first time, they've been out of the political space, out there protesting. Part and parcel to the problem, though, is that 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash. What is your bias in that situation? Your bias is to go in the side of the cash, especially if the politics or the people have accepted blue no matter who, and in accepting blue no matter who has allowed and accepted the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to go in opposite directions as opposed to the public wants. So 90% of the races are won by the side with most cash. The politicians spend 75% of their time begging for dollars. Please put it in my G-string, daddy. That type of stuff. But those things breed corruption in your system. And because there's no overarching thing that sets in stone which particular way you go, you guys get implicit choice to bust or to not. Because I tell you this, you can't keep going like this.
I'm going to give you this. There's this other take on the same set of problems. There's this problem called the principal agent problem.
Yeah.
Basically, the idea is you have a principal, you have somebody whose interests are supposed to be represented, and then they have an agent who's supposed to represent their interests. But the problem is, of course, if you have somebody else doing something for you, they are operating under their own incentives.
Yes.
You might want them to do something. There might be something that they should be doing for you, but for a variety of reasons, they're going to be disincentivized from doing that. And that's a huge problem in all sorts of different areas. Any organization has to face this problem because you're having to delegate tasks. It's a real problem, though, in government. Ostensibly, the government is the agent of the people.
Yes.
We're the principals. They should be doing what we want. And the problem, there are a whole bunch of different ways you could put this, but I would say one key problem is we have increasingly lost incentives for politicians to actually do what people want them to do.
Yes.
Through the degradation of the political process over arguably the last couple of centuries, although some would pinpoint it a little bit more locally in time. Through that degradation, it's like the mechanisms of repair that we could use to keep our government doing what we want have gotten weaker and weaker and weaker, and therefore their monopoly has gotten stronger. You're saying the public is sheep. I would say, if anything, okay, there's like plenty of sheep-like attributes of the public, and plenty of people probably act like sheep, colloquially. But if anything, I would say the members of the ivory tower, members of our government, they're sheep. They're standing in line in gridlock. The public's fighting over stuff. If we're sheep, we're sort of weird half hybrid wolf sheep mixes, because we're simultaneously going along in groups and then fighting with other groups. But we are fighting, as far as I can tell. The Democrats and the Republicans are play fighting. There's this term like kayfabe, the whole thing in professional wrestling. I don't know if you've heard about this, where it's this idea that it's all constructed, but there's this weird irony because professional wrestling is simultaneously real and dangerous. People die from it, but it's also completely fake and constructed. It's like I see the exact same thing happening here. Politicians are pretending to fight, pretend disagreements, but really at the end of the day, they just kind of go along with each other.
Yeah, you can't pretend to jump off of a top rope, right? Like you either do it or you don't. No, I agree with you. It's like performative. That's kind of what I mean when I say like these guys take these performative theatrical maneuvers that don't really mean anything in practice. We actually have real things that we need and want to be attended to. And you have a political space that we're supposed to believe is supposed to represent our interests in some way. There's supposed to be some attachment, some social fabric that keeps me associated with you. So as we move along in this kind of pathway of life, we're still connected in some way. We understand that connection. We honor that connection. And if anything else, that connection goes beyond anything else, even politics. And that's where the problem comes in. Because ultimately, you're in a situation where we want the political class to do X. And the political class has their own things and ideas that they want. But ideally, America matters more. Like John Wayne, who said, didn't appreciate John F. Kennedy winning, but said, that's my president and I'll back him. He at the very least had a higher notion of what America was, whether he had it in real life or whether he had it just in public, in his own personal home. I'm just making the point that the moment that you lose this notion of the grand lie or the grand deception, whatever that is, that all of you guys organize around, whether it's the Constitution, whether it's, Hammurabi's codes or whatever it's called, Hammurabi's codes, whatever those things are, it is vital and necessary that those tethers stay. Because the moment it breaks down, it is hard to put back together. Think of Newt Gingrich going in Congress, just slamming other people in Congress. And think of how mean-spirited politics has gotten, where it's all, a zero-sum game where I got to utterly obliterate my opponent. Think of what they did to Obama with the Supreme Court thing, or impeaching Bill Clinton, or the Russiagate stuff. Like, this is politics in a way that is rough, like in the way that they are playing it. And I got to be honest, I don't see how an irrational system like this can continue on for in perpetuity. I just don't.
So this is an attempt at a horrible metaphor, but politics is something like puppetry, something like, it's political theater, like you're saying, two wings on the same bird. And this is where the metaphor gets really weird. But it's like instead of there being two different gloves or one person who has their hand up each glove, get those images out of your mind. Instead of that being the case, it's almost like there are a bunch of people struggling to they're struggling with each other to get influence.
Yeah.
The problem that I'm pointing out here is there is no leadership. It's just, as far as I can tell, conspiracy theories be damned. And again, there are characters behind the scenes who influence policies greatly, who, again, have outsized influence. As far as I can tell, though, it's not like there's one leading force. It's like a variety of competing forces. And that's the problem with that, is that also happens in the public sphere. Like democracy, modern democracy is riddled with these divisions. That's been practically everything we talk about is like the result of these divisions. But at the same time, in the sort of unseen subterranean layer of things, I'm sure that there's all this infighting and stuff going on. So at every level, and for that reason alone, I almost have to pity these people, pity the politicians, because, they get up there, they're supposed to say things. They know that nothing they're going to do on some deep level is probably really going to matter. At least that's my sort of cynical take. On the one hand, I kind of pity for them. On the other hand, screw that. These guys are terrible. The system should not.
I'm living on the other hand. I'm at the screw that point.
Yeah, same. Anyway, we're going to go into a break. You know what? We're taking calls in this next segment. Then we're going to be joined spectacularly by Lee Camp at 9:30. But regardless, if you want to call in, you can. 202-521-1320 is the number. 202-521-1320. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Huge static from you guys.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Again, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. But while we wait for those calls to come in, why not spread the word a little bit? If you want to listen to us in Washington, D.C., you can on the radio, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. On the other hand, if you're in Kansas City, these are our two broadcasting locations. In Kansas City, you can listen to us 102.9 and 104.7 FM and 1140 AM. Now, those are our two radio platforms, our centers, but we're also online everywhere. You can find us on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, YouTube, iHeartRadio, Periscope sometimes. And we're building that Periscope up to be its own permanent presence. Anyway, that's a long story. Regardless, though.
You're okay?
And we're going into it. Yeah.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Good.
All right. So you know what? A bunch of different directions we could go. I was thinking one really controversial one would be the global warming stuff, but anything on your mind?
Yeah. You said that's controversial? What's controversial about the global warming stuff?
Well, it's controversial because of the Guy McPherson apocalyptic side of things.
Oh.
And then it's also controversial.
I see.
Yeah. And it's also controversial because it's just a controversial topic. You know, we've had Dollar who was asking about it was pretty cynical about the idea that it is, if I remember correctly, he didn't think it was caused by humans. But you know what? We actually do have a call.
He seemed to think it was caused by a bunch of other stuff. But we have Michael from Sydney. Michael, how's it going?
Yeah, hi guys. Look, I'd just like to pick up on a point that you were making earlier, like in the first segment of the show. You know, about identity politics and appeasing people by appointing Kamala Harris, as as VP candidate or whoever they appoint. I mean, if you go way back to Martin Luther King, I mean, he said, "Judge a person on the content of their character." And Kamala Harris, I mean, her character is atrocious. Well, whether she's black, whether she's female, her character is atrocious. It doesn't matter, And I mean, I think the problem with identity politics is I support gay rights, I support Black Lives Matter, I support all of it, and I'm a white man. But I mean, most people, black, white, or whatever, don't really care if there's a toilet available for transgender people to use or gay people to use if they can't put food on the table. I mean, if playing identity politics just divides the working class and sets us against each other. Most people's primary concern isn't about identity politics. Most people's primary concern is about not getting, beaten up by the police and stuff like that. That's a legitimate issue. And it's not just white people, it's not just black people who suffer that. Poor white people suffer the same, maybe not to the same extent, but they suffer it, most people are really concerned with their economic subsistence in life and being able to have a decent life for themselves and their children. They don't really care about identity politics. What they really care about is having a decent quality of life for themselves, right? Whether they're gay, whether they're black, whether they're white. And I mean, look at Barack Obama, okay, the black president. He presided over Ferguson. He presided over Chicago. He presided over Standing Rock. Where is Barack Obama protecting the rights of indigenous people during Standing Rock? I mean, he did nothing, and then they sent in, basically people to brutalize Native American Indians, just like they're doing now in the Black Lives Matter movement. Barack Obama's character was no good, right? It doesn't matter whether you're gay, it doesn't matter if you're black, it doesn't matter if you're white. I don't care what you are. I judge a person on the content of their character.
Well, another, I mean, I agree with all of that, Michael. Another interesting take is that if you look at the politicians with the highest IQ, the highest intersectionality quotient, I'm not talking about brains, I'm just talking about the people who have the most sort of points of these different, again, identity politics, this intersection of potential minority positions, et cetera. I don't need to get too deep into it. If you look at the politicians who have that, you brought up Kamala Harris, but I'd also go with Tulsi Gabbard. And I have to say, of all the candidates who are running in the 2020 election, early on during the primaries, Tulsi is probably the one that I'd choose to lead us during this pandemic. She has that sort of no-nonsense mindset. She gets down to the meat of the matter, all that stuff. And she's also a woman from Hawaii of a minority ethnic group. Again, I'm not trying to compare apples and oranges here or whatever, but I'm saying the point there is it's actually not. It's like in the same way that politics in general is a theater, I think the identity politics stuff is just a theater too. If the genuine change that people want, sure, there are a lot of racists in the country. I'm sure there's plenty of latent racism, totally. But really, I think that I don't want to misrepresent here, but I'm guessing that what a lot of people really care about isn't what some random person is saying on the other side of the country or even in their town. It's this like widespread economic disparity. It's like the criminal justice stuff that you're bringing up. It's these deeper issues. And again, the intersectionality stuff, I don't need to get too deep into that, but the identity politics stuff specifically does seem like a significant distraction from those fundamental issues. So in another way, it's just this layer cake of illusions. Jamar, although I didn't mean to cut you off.
Dodge. No. That was a space, and I thought you were stopping. No, the identity politics stuff. I agree with you. And Michael, thank you for calling, Michael. We appreciate your call. Yeah, the identity politics stuff. I agree with you, Shane. It's the distraction in some cases. Don't misunderstand me. If you were back in the '60s and you wanted to sit down in the bus, or somebody wanted to push you in the back, well, those are real, tangible, material concerns in regards to the jobs that you could get, the places that you could live, the loans that you can get for your businesses, all of those things going all the way up to this kind of momentum of history to maybe the 80s and 90s. And so you have this society that intentionally plugs off or isolates another member of that society, putting them in difficult situations to which they have negative outcomes and disparities because of such. And then you say, but hey, this guy's black. Is that enough? Well, the answer should be no. Now, it's one thing if you're voting for somebody in and putting that person in an office, if they give you what you want in regards to policy, then the race is incidental. It's like, okay, right, it's a cherry on top. But it shouldn't be the main thing. I mean, this is not the 60s. This is not a situation where these things are as rigid and as unpliable as they were back then. This is now. And using that identity politics is, I'm sorry, I think most of the time it's a dodge. Now, by the way, real quick, that doesn't mean that you don't defend and stand ideologically with those identities. Meaning you don't want, as a lefty, I don't want anybody's rights curtailed. I don't want any of these groups, I don't care what those groups are, to not be able to express themselves and live full lives within the context, relatively, of the law. And so, I'm against any kind of pushing back on those on race or class or sex. I mean, on race and sex and with those type of things. But I do believe we need to stand in solidarity with that stuff. But the focus has to be on issues of class. Those are the things that materially benefit the population. And those are the things that give you a certain degree of economic justice.
And I think one of the issues here. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, I'm sorry. No. I'm sorry. Let's go with EJ.
Let's go with EJ. EJ, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, how's it going? I do agree with that weaponization of identity. I think that that's a huge problem. I respect the struggles of these individual groups, but it's being used to our detriment at this point in time because we're dividing ourselves. That divide and conquer strategy is being used against the ruling class, which is corporations and governments versus the people. It's kind of like Bacon's Rebellion all over again. But I think that there was some talk about slavery earlier in the conversation, and I don't think that we pay enough attention to why slavery ended. And just thinking about Abraham Lincoln, he once said, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" And this is going back. I called in earlier at a different show, and I talked about the Emancipation Proclamation and the real reason behind it was because of the revolts. You know, Abraham Lincoln had a strong fear of another Christmas rebellion, that sort of thing that happened in Jamaica, where these were totally different situations. 60,000 people liberated themselves. They retreated to the mountains, and then they killed every white face that they could. Not saying that it's a good thing, but they ended slavery. Even though they lost the war, they made their point that we'd rather die than be slaves. This institution of slavery is so important that it was they repackaged it as the 13th Amendment, the clause under the 13th Amendment in the prison system to curtail, to prevent people from rebelling. They're in cages now. There's no open access to farms for you to burn crops and kill people and overturn. Slavery still happens today, and we're not paying attention to the fact that most of our problems come from politicians, it comes from corporations, it comes from dividing us. We all have the same material needs, and they're not being represented because we're too busy pointing fingers using this weaponization of identity. And there are people that are infiltrating all of these respective groups and pitting them against each other. I know I got no time, so I'm just going to stop there.
That was on point, man. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, Yeah, Jamal, I saw you talking to us in the chat room back here, so on the back end. So I didn't know if you had some stuff to say there, but no, that was absolutely on point. Thanks for the call, EJ. Great historical call. Great historical info too. Yeah, interesting stuff.
Yeah, I thought that was good. I thought that was extremely good. 13th Amendment, exactly. No, I didn't have anything to push back on that. I mean, I think he's right in the sense that the 13th Amendment, I've heard the argument before that the 13th Amendment legitimized and basically allowed slavery in the United States, where you can rip away somebody's freedom and criminalize that person here. Basically. Yeah, right. Exactly. That's his point. Yeah, that's his point.
I can quote it right here. I'll quote the relevant section because it's pretty damn relevant. Quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. End quote. In other words, slavery got abolished, involuntary servitude got abolished, except as punishment for a crime. Yeah, I mean, again, people talk about mass incarceration. That's a real thing. What complicates it for me, so I totally see that in there. What complicates it for me is the prison system is also hellaciously expensive. And so from like this financial angle, I don't see how it works out financially. There is this social aspect of it. We're talking about the underclass, the idea of like this permanent underclass, an economic underclass. And I can sort of see that as a result of the inevitable creation of that. But it also, I don't know, again, prisons are really expensive for the government. And at least that's my understanding. And so I don't think it's a financial slavery. I don't think it's like an economic servitude. But maybe I'm wrong about that.
I think prisons are cheaper than the alternative. I mean, because think about it for the moment. The reason why I always go to poverty when I think of defund the police is because I ask, why are the cops there? And basically the cops are there because you've allowed certain contradictions to take place in your society to go unresolved. And instead of dealing with those things, many of which are economic contradictions or economic realities that people don't have what they need just to get from point A to point B, and you create struggle and strife in those communities. And then, so there are two ways to deal with it. You could either pull those societies out of poverty, meaning pull those areas out of poverty, lift those areas up and bring them into the box that has low crime because those things are more economically thriving. Or you could throw in cops. Now, cops can never deal with that job because at the end of the day, cops are just reactive and they can never fix the material issues of poverty that is causing strife in those communities. Now, I'm not saying that it takes away all poverty. I'm just saying from a statistical standpoint, you can take a certain section of right off the top. If you're looking for low-hanging fruit in dealing with crime and chaos and diseases of despair and whatnot, those things are there for you to get rid of. But it costs money to do so. And it just so happened might be cheaper than the prison system. So you have jails.
That's interesting. That's a lot of interesting stuff to think about. You know what? We've got another caller. We've got Adam from Virginia on the line. Adam, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
All right. Thanks for taking my call. I'll be quick because I know you got Lee Camp in the on deck circle. All right. Related to the exception clause in the 13th Amendment, there is a book called Slavery by Another Name. And I really recommend you read it if you haven't already, by Douglas Blackman is the author. And he discovered an entire network that grew, that took advantage of that loophole and developed the industry of the South post-Civil War. And it's based on convict labor, which I think has a direct relation, connecting the dots, to today's for-profit prisons.
That's a very interesting recommendation. Just looking into that now. Thank you for the call. Great calls today. Yeah. You know what? I'm gonna sort of close us out there. I just really want to express appreciation for the callers, though. We're going into a break. We'll be joined again in just a minute by Lee Camp. First time on our incarnation of the show, but it'll be fun having him on. We'll get back to it in just a minute here. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You know what? I'll get this thing out of the way before we bring Lee Camp in. You can listen to us on, and we are, by the way, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You can listen to us on radio in the DC area at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM, or in Kansas City, you can listen to us at 102.9 FM or 104.7 FM. Also, 1140 AM. You can also catch us online, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Spotify, often Periscope. Regardless, with all that out of the way, you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are joined now, very happily, by Lee Camp, who is an American stand-up comedian, writer, actor, and activist. You can also watch him. He hosts weekly comedy news show, Redacted Tonight, with Lee Camp on RT America. He is also the host of the Common Censored podcast. You can also check him out on Twitter at LEECAMP, Lee Camp. Lee, thank you for joining us this morning.
End of days.
Are you doing all right, Lee? Can you hear us okay?
Hello?
Hey, we can hear you.
There you are.
Hey, yeah.
Yeah, I got you.
Awesome. Okay, great to have you. Great to have you. So I'm actually a bunch of different directions we can go. My producer, a producer on the show, just told us you were talking about your descendant of Robert E. Lee.
Yeah, so I'm a descendant of Robert E. Lee, as well as George Washington and John Marshall, one of the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court. Appears the oligarchy was a small club back in the day. And as a descendant of Robert E. Lee, I got to tell you how horrified I am to see the statues coming down. No, actually, they should definitely come down. They should be moved to a museum that displays racist statues. And that's what I covered on Redacted Tonight this week, that, the arguments for keeping these Confederate statues and Columbus statues in place just really don't hold water. The idea, this is our history. Yeah, that really is the only way you can tell history, is by metallic facsimiles made out of, 30% copper and 50% pigeon poop.
Lee, now that I know that you're a descendant of Robert E. Lee, I'm going to say you probably owe me like $5 just as your share of reparations. I'm teasing. I'm joking. I'm joking.
$5.
No, I'm joking. The Robert E. Lee thing is interesting, though, to me. I mean, I know that statue, Ken Burns, it kind of made a comment. I lived in Richmond, Virginia. We used to pass that statue all the time. Ken Burns said, take them down. Because Ken Burns' argument was basically these things are glorifying something that was atrocious. And it's an attempt by the South to basically rewrite history through monuments and give this kind of reverence in a way that was not deserved based on what these guys was trying to accomplish. What do you think about that? Do you think that's the closest truth? And if it means to be taken down, let's say not by official means, but even being unofficial means, is that a valid way of going about our affairs?
Yeah, I also grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and knew the new Monument Avenue well. I was happy when I was a kid to see they added Arthur Ashe to the Monument Avenue. However, unfortunately, Monument Avenue now is Civil War generals on horseback chasing Arthur Ashe. So I don't know if that's a good look either. But it's definitely a rewriting of history, and most people don't know that the vast majority of these Confederate statues did not go up right after the Civil War. Instead, they went up in mainly two waves right after the 1900s as a screw you to black people looking for equality, looking for rights. And then there was another wave in the 50s and 60s around civil rights, the big push for civil rights. And it was a way of saying, no, we will never give you civil rights. We do not want equality. It is standing up for white supremacy. And that is why it was put up, nearly 100 years after the Civil War. Same with the Confederate battle flag, which is the stars and bars that we have grown accustomed to seeing in the South, that flag was not really popularized until the 40s and 50s, when it had a resurgence as a way of saying, I stand for white supremacy and against civil rights. So if people actually want to look into the context of these things, then they can learn why these are so offensive, and not just, well, it's our history. Well, there's ways to learn history. Then there's ways to kind of abuse history to use it as a stance of white supremacy.
Something we've been talking about lately. Something we've been talking about lately. Come back to you, Jamal. Didn't mean to cut you off there. Something we've been talking about is the political complicity in this whole. That was actually pretty poorly formed. Here's what I mean by that. There is a genuine movement, like you're talking about, that has a lot of grievances that we need to repair in order to move forward as a country. And yet it seems to me like the establishment Democrats, the establishment Republicans to some extent, the establishment Democrats specifically, are trying to sort of play into that movement to the extent that they can for sheer survival, just to maintain their positions of power. But you have this wider breakdown of any real attempts at improvements that would, alleviate or ameliorate the actual foundational problems, economic inequality, maybe reparations, attempting to actually fix the, racial disparities in income and in inherited wealth. Obviously, policing, that's become a big thing. Anyway, you see some bills getting pushed forward, and the movement definitely has the potential. It's a big movement. It has the potential to make change. But it seems like the political class as such has sort of betrayed that, like they tend to. So I'm curious, you've revealed some of it with what you were just saying, but I'm curious, what camp do you fall into? Do you fall into the sort of left take on this? Where do you see elements of truth in the right? Are you in neither camp? Are you in the Lee camp? What's your take?
Well, let's not fall into the trap of acting like the Democrats are the left and the Republicans are the right. You basically, we're told we have two choices in this country. We have the choice of the Republicans, who seem to not care at all about this fight for racial equality and fight for Black Lives Matter and against police brutality. And then you have the Democrats who, as you're saying, give this little show about how they care about Black Lives Matter and care about police brutality, and then proceed to basically change nothing. So those are your two choices. Neither of them are going to actually help, except one of them will make a show of helping and one of them won't. So you're absolutely right that we need far larger systemic changes in policing in this country and so much more, rather than just these little, window dressing issues. Like, yes, of course, we need to ban chokeholds, but saying to our police system, hey, we need you to start killing Black and brown people in a manner that is a little better than chokeholds. Okay, great. Well, that hasn't really fixed our system, has it? So, yes, it's not that these things shouldn't be done, but that should not be seen as some grand achievement that gets everyone to go home and stop complaining. Same with painting Black Lives Matter on the road. It should happen, sure. There should be a Black Lives Matter plaza. Why not? But if people want to look at that as, we achieved that, that's a big achievement, and we can now, our anger has been quashed because we got something painted on a road, then that's a major problem. And I think it's actually absolutely cynically being used. It's cynically being used by both sides, Republicans and Democrats. It's being used by the Democrats in terms of acting like they did something, with their kneeling down in the Senate with the kente cloths on and stuff like that. And it's being cynically used by the Republicans to try and get all the white people in America that might identify with Trump in various ways to get furious and worry that their nation is being taken from them, when in fact, Donald Trump has given more to the rich in this country than many presidents have. A larger tax base, wealth inequality gap keeps growing at ridiculous margins. So it's not like they're actually getting anything from Donald Trump. And, Joe Biden was more pivotal in creating a systemic racist America than many people, with the crime bill and doubling the prison population. And Joe Biden likes for his name to be equated with the crime bills and pro-policing bills throughout the 80s and 90s and however many other decades he's been alive and walking around the Senate. So, you have basically in this presidential race, you have the choice between two forms of racism: the one that says it outright, and the one who says he's for something else but isn't.
You know, Lee, have you heard anything about this trial balloon that they put up saying that because of how bad and disastrous the polling has been for Donald Trump? I mean, I've said that a ham sandwich will be further ahead than Joe Biden is right now against Donald Trump. Both of these guys, under any normal circumstance, will be infinitely beatable, and yet you've put both of them against each other. And so right now, Donald Trump is getting crushed in the polling. Now, I know a lot of people make comparisons to 2016, but I would say this is different than 2016 because in 2016 you had the image of Trump running, not necessarily the actuality of him being in office. But on top of that, you also have this notion of, 120,000, 28,000 people dead, 2.8 infected, and that number is only going to get higher day after day after day after day after day. Do you think that potentially the trial balloon of whether or not they should replace Donald Trump is legit? I don't necessarily think it is. By the same token, we're in unprecedented territory in regards to how bad this election defeat can be for Trump if things continue the way they're going.
Yeah, I mean, even before the pandemic, I said that the only things that would ever, make it so that Donald Trump would lose to Joe Biden because of how out of it Biden is, because of Biden's record, a million different things. The only thing that could possibly cause him to lose is an economic collapse, and we're seeing that on top of a pandemic where, the economy is going to keep collapsing, probably get a lot worse in a month or two. So he very well, like you said, he very well could lose, but he would lose to a ham sandwich. And those of us who are vegetarians would probably still vote for the ham sandwich. So it's looking bad for him. But the thing that people aren't talking about and really doesn't get any talk, I think I talked about it last time I was on your show maybe, but it doesn't get any talk in the mainstream media, is the fact that 1 out of every 12 voters or more have been purged already going into this election. So it's not like if Biden's up by 5 points, he will win this election. He'd have to be up by 20 points or 15 points or something to win the election. So he very well could win it, but it will be overcoming some massive voter purging that has already happened. And it enrages me that it's not discussed more because even if people weren't going to notice it in this election, they'll notice it in the next one or the one after. So it's totally infuriating the amount of people that have been purged. And of course, we've seen the test runs for what this election is going to look like in Kentucky, in Georgia, where they're closing hundreds of polling places, people waiting in line for 8 hours or whatever. It's a joke. And, we have one of the worst electoral systems in the Western world. And then we run around and act like these polls are all that matter. But of course, these polls are polling people that think they're going to vote. So it really is just infuriating on so many levels. I mean, I obviously think people need to vote, but I think that change tends to come when it comes for the people, when it comes for people, across America, it tends to come on a street level. It tends to come on a neighborhood level. It does not tend to come through our rigged electoral system that has been bought out by corporations that are more powerful than anything we could ever imagine and, richer than they've ever been before. Trillions of dollars at their fingertips to purchase these elections. It really is. Change is going to come elsewhere, I think.
Yeah, the more money, apparently they 40 million people are out of a job. Jeff Bezos is on the way to be a trillionaire. Great system we have. We're here with Lee Camp. We're going to be right back with him in a moment. Lee Camp is an American stand-up comedian, writer, activist. He hosts a weekly comedy show called Redacted Tonight on RT America and Common Censored Podcasts. We'll be right back in a moment. Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines.
Yo! So Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts.
I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we are back. Again, we're live. It is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan that you're listening to. You've also been listening to the voice of Lee Camp, who's joining us now. Lee Camp is an American stand-up comedian, writer, actor, and activist. He hosts the weekly comedy news show Redacted Tonight with Lee Camp on RT America. He's also the host of the Common Censored podcast. And again, if you want to check him out, you can find him on Twitter at Lee Camp, Leecamp. Lee, thanks so much for joining us again. So I actually wanted to continue sort of in this vein, talking about the protests, talking about the potential for this wider follow-on effect on the economy, not just from the protests, but from the pandemic. We have the threat of a rent crisis coming up. I'm curious, I don't know exactly how this is going to go. Nobody does, really. But I'm guessing that the government's going to try to pull out a few more of the stops, try to dump some more money into the market, try to stave off the, worst real potential for real high levels of civil unrest that we really actually haven't started to see, I don't think, yet. They're going to try to stave that stuff off. They're going to try to plug more holes in the dike, basically, for as long as they can. That's my sort of pessimistic/optimistic take. But they're going to do that just as long as they can until they get into this election cycle. At least that's the sort of set of events that seems most likely to me. What's your take on what's going to happen? Where are we going as a country? Where are we going economically? What do you see going on here?
Well, you're absolutely right that that we have a tsunami, economic tsunami that is, cresting above our heads, and the, Congress and the others will try and put Band-Aids on it to stop it from happening. If you will accept a phenomenally mixed metaphor. I mean, putting a Band-Aid on a tsunami doesn't even make any sense. But maybe that's a good analogy, because it doesn't make sense what they're doing. Here's the thing: is the Band-Aids they're putting on, the duct tape and chewing gum that they are sticking to keep this thing together, is given to the rich and the ruling elite largely in order for them to basically keep their businesses afloat and stuff like that. Whereas you could put patches on this system that would keep it afloat, and those patches could go to the people far more largely than a $1,200 breadcrumb check. So you look at what Denmark's done, and Denmark, yes, gave bailout money to companies, but that bailout money was attached to a requirement that they kept all their employees. So people aren't getting unemployed. There's a way to do this where the money is given, the money and the benefits are given more to the people rather than to the rich. But instead, our ruling elite, our oligarchy in Congress, that is completely anathema to the way they behave. They can't even understand a system where they actually help the people rather than helping the rich. So instead, they've given these massive, giveaways to big banks, Wall Street, the largest corporations in the world. If you take the amount of money leveraged by the Federal Reserve, it's $4.25 trillion that will be given to big banks in the form of guaranteed loans. It's an absolute theft, the largest theft maybe we've ever seen in this country or in the world. And that's what's going on behind the scenes while people try and pay their rent. If you just think about it, we're basically saying, okay, the rent freeze is over and now everyone's got to start paying their rent, because if we decide what is a requirement in our society, well, you have to pay rent. Well, why isn't a requirement in our society that people don't lose their homes in the middle of a pandemic? Why isn't that the requirement rather than you must pay your rent or get kicked out on the street? We could be looking at this in a completely reverse manner, but instead everything is looked at in terms of how do we make sure the people at the top of the systems continue to benefit.
Basically, strong survive and everybody else can, go find something else to do.
Well, the strong in terms of wealth.
Right. That's what I mean by strong. I'm being very specific in this case to wealth. I was watching this case where a grandmother was on a food line in the cold, 70-something years old, trying to get meat and protein because she doesn't have any because, when the jobs went bust and her income went bust with it. And, these people are just subsisting in many respects. And this was, by the way, you had that situation where 40%, nearly 50% of the population was making under $18,000 a year. That is mind-blowing on living off numbers like that. And then having this expectation of someone to be involved in enlightened society. I think it's going to be chaos. What do you think happens with this? Because I agree that the collapse of the economy, or at the very least the housing market, is coming. People are going to be evicted and thrown out of their homes. They're already starting these evictions. The money that the government is giving, that money is going to shrivel up and go away. And on top of that money shriveling up and going away, you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be in desperate needs for cash or potentially out on the street. I suspect strongly that those people are going to join with the protest because why not? At that point, you have nothing else to nothing else to lose. Basically, your society has ruined the social contract, in which case you pull yourself out of the political system. But where does that energy go? It's not going to go to the Democrats because, even if they get the votes, they're not doing anything that could actually subsume and eliminate the energy coming from the protests. And Republicans damn sure aren't. So what happens when these two political parties in this country continue and flagrantly ignore the will of the protesters, which is going to get larger and larger?
Yeah, well, I think as is common with extreme anger and frustration and misery, you're going to see it go in two directions. One is going to be in a kind of detrimental, maybe violent manner, but, a form of anger towards others. It can be, as we've seen already in this country, anger can be directed towards immigrants or towards, other people who don't look like you. And some of it will go that way. The hope, I guess, if you want to remain hopeful, is that a lot of that energy, once people have nothing left, it will be channeled into, well, how do I join with my community? How do I help make sure my neighbor doesn't get evicted? How do I make sure my friends have food for this coming week? And we're seeing it, in mutual aid efforts around the country. We're seeing it in a lot of people standing up for people that they might not actually self-identify with, like I may not be black, but I want to stand with Black Lives Matter, those kind of things. And hopefully a lot of that anger and frustration is channeled in the positive direction instead of in the negative. Now, that doesn't mean in the short term, even if that happens, it doesn't mean in the short term there won't be a lot of people suffering. There will. And of course, I don't want to see that. But in terms of what Congress could do is if they wanted to, they could pass bailouts that continue to go to the people. They could pass eviction freezes. They could pass universal basic income that is steady rather than a single check, $2,000 a month or something for a family that continues. There are things they could do. And I know that sounds like a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to the trillions given to the big banks or the amount of subsidies given to big oil to keep them afloat as the fracking business has collapsed now because it's not actually profitable to frack. And yet they continue to put pipelines down that are destroying people's land and water. So, the money is certainly there. The money in the military-industrial complex is an amount of money we could never even comprehend. And so the money's there to do all these things if the will is there. And, I suppose it's conceivable. It's unlikely, but I suppose it's conceivable that if enough people get angry and protest on the streets and Congress actually fears for their jobs enough that they might actually begin passing things like that.
I really hope so. I mean, the concern that a lot of us have, I think, we're looking at these protests. We agree with the causes of the protests, the economic history, the racial stuff, everything. There's a lot there. But then, of course, it gets violent. The protest started off, there's looting going on. That sort of initiated this wave of police responses. Of course, this was itself a response to police violence. So I don't mean to denigrate that too much. But again, the concern that a lot of us have is when it gets a little bit later in the year, either before the election or after the election, we're starting to see the real deep consequences of this. Many months into it, people are getting evicted, all that stuff. I don't know. Another side of this is if we had sort of constructive local institutions of civic engagement, then I think that there's a lot more opportunity for the kind of positive outlet that you're talking about, for people to use this motivation, to use this built-up energy to invest it in something. And maybe now is an opportunity, maybe now is a really key time for people to come back to that practice, come back to engaging locally, civically. But on the other hand, I'm worried that things are not going to be so pacific. I'm worried that things are going to go downhill. It's going to get violent. This is going to cause, of course, the government to respond more than proportionally. It's going to cause, government suppression, what would look like a pretty quasi-fascist state, that kind of thing. I could see the international community rejecting that. I could see the international community, which they've already started to, again, wave of Black Lives Matter protests around the world. I could see our supposed allies pushing away from us because they see the terrible things that the United States is doing. And I can just see this whole thing crumbling. And that thought, even though there are elements of that are promising, because then you get to remake the system, you get to reform it, that thought terrifies me because that's millions of lives. That's millions of people. I don't mean to be too heavy here. And again, I think that your take on it, the direction you're going with it is exactly the right one. But I just wanted to share my concerns. What's your take on that whole set of issues?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to see a collapsed society. I do want to see large-scale change, but I don't want to see people that are truly miserable and homeless. And at this point, I don't think I can predict which way it'll go. I think that when push comes to shove, there is a lot of people who care in our society and American society. And even if they, because a lot of the anger, the hatred that comes from, let's say, Trump supporters towards others, it's a propaganda they're watching. It's a Fox News reports about how they need to hate immigrants and those kind of things. But these people often care about their neighbors and things like that. So there is still an ability to care and sympathize for the struggle of others around them. And so I think there's a lot of empathy there that could be tapped into. So I sincerely hope that this isn't just, everyone figuring out how many guns they need in their bunker with their baked beans. I don't really see that going that way, but it is tough to analyze and it's tough to figure out. And in terms of you have these two figureheads that are going towards an election, and one of them seems to be this kind of greater threat because he is tweeting out, white power stuff, and he enrages people on that level, on this kind of visceral, idiotic level. But on the other side, you have somebody who's helped imprison, more black people in this country than perhaps any active politician. So it's like, it's not as night and day as people want to act like. There's so many liberals out there who think that you just get Trump out of office and all is well in America. And of course, that's laughable. The prison industrial complex grew massively under Obama. So did the surveillance state. So it really comes down to education. People have to understand these systems and these problems to actually create change that is not just surface change, that is not just, oh, thank goodness we got the president out of office who was actively racist on a front and center basis, and we've put in the one who's racist on a systemic level. You gotta, it comes down to education, which, hopefully what you guys do and what I do is educate people on those issues.
That is the voice of Lee Kemp. Great appearance, Lee. And thank you for bringing some light and I think a perspective on goodness. Again, this common ground, this pursuit of empathy for other people. I think that is the right take. That's the right sort of background, emotional attitude we should have. Regardless, Lee Kemp is an American stand-up comedian, writer, actor, and activist. He hosts the weekly comedy news show Redacted Tonight with Lee Kemp on RT America. He's also the host of the Common Censored podcast. If you want to follow him on Twitter, you can at Lee Kemp. That's LEECAMP. Jamarl, I thought today was another great show. I opened this show up talking about bringing people the truth even when it hurts. And I think some of these truths hurt, but we need to keep hearing them. We need to keep talking about them.
No, I agree with you. I mean, any level of change requires chaos. And chaos is the thing that people don't necessarily want to deal with. So I agree.
We'll be back tomorrow. Yeah, no, thank you, Jamarl. We'll be back tomorrow with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, thank you all for joining me again. As always, let me check my numbers. My numbers always change when I'm doing this show, and I'm trying to do a lot of things at once, like keeping track of stuff. But yes, Jamal, will you be back later? Another live stream? Yeah, I'll be back in a few. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. I love the conversations. Shane and I trend towards these kind of philosophical, almost esoteric conversations, just in the way that we think about this stuff. I think I have my chess logic kind of takes me to vicious ends, I guess, sometimes, in the way I look at the world, and Shane tends to be less that way. So it becomes an interesting dynamic in the way that we talk about the show, and I thought the show was great. So I love these conversations. Hopefully we can keep them up, and we can give you guys this kind of space to have politics, philosophy, I don't know, esoteric stuff, the works, and just kind of throw that stuff up in the air, and we see where we come down on it. But we give you an honest opinion, an honest appraisal in regards to the way we see it, and hopefully you guys dig it. So, very cool, great show. It's funny, I have all these notes that I'm writing down, trying to get ideas for the next, process ideas. But I'm going to leave this here. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. I'll see you guys a bit later. Thanks, everyone. Oh, and we have, let's see, Peter version 1. Jamal on audio. You Van Jones video is messed up. Is it? Jamal, the audio on the Van Jones? Okay, I'll check it now. I hope not, because that thing was late at night. But thank you for the heads up, Peter version 1. I'll check it now. Thanks all.